Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relaxed and dive into tonight's stories. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded over nearly 2 decades in the quiet heart of Florida. A story of betrayal, secrets, and a mother's unwavering determination. This is the story of Mike Williams, a man who loved the stillness of dawn on the water, who worked tirelessly for his family, and who trusted the wrong people. In the late autumn of 1969, on October 16th, a baby boy was born in Tallahassee, Florida. His parents, Cheryl and Jerry Williams, named him Jerry Michael Williams, though everyone would come to know him simply as Mike. He was the younger of 2 sons, raised in Bradfordville, a modest community where neighbors knew each other's names and families gathered on front porches in the evening heat. Mike's childhood was unremarkable in the best way. His mother ran a daycare from their home, filling the house with the laughter of children. His father drove buses for Greyhound, working long routes to provide for his family. The Williams household wasn't wealthy, but it was rich in the things that mattered: love, stability, hard work. From the time Mike was 15 years old, he discovered something that would become a lifelong passion: duck hunting. There's something about the pre-dawn hours on a lake that speaks to certain souls. The mist rising off dark water, the sound of wings cutting through cold air, the absolute stillness before the sun breaks the horizon. For Mike, those hours on the water weren't just about hunting. They were meditation, peace, a place where the noise of the world couldn't reach him. He attended North Florida Christian School, a small private institution where relationships ran deep and lasted long. It was there, in the halls and classrooms of that close-knit school, that Mike met the people who would shape the rest of his life. His future wife, Denise Merle, was a cheerleader with a bright smile. His best friend, Brian Winchester, was someone he trusted completely, someone he thought would be by his side forever, and Kathy Thomas, who would become Brian's wife, completed their circle of 4. They were typical teenagers in many ways. They went to concerts, they double-dated, they planned futures together, 2 couples who seemed destined to grow old as friends, raising children who would play together, celebrating holidays and milestones side by side. After high school, Mike attended Florida State University, where he studied political science and urban planning. But more importantly, he met his calling. Before he even graduated, he was hired by Ketchum Appraisal Group as a property appraiser. His boss would later describe him as the hardest working man he had ever seen. Mike had found something he was good at, something that could provide for the family he wanted to build. In 1994, Mike married his high school sweetheart, Denise. The wedding photos show a young couple full of hope, surrounded by friends who had known them since they were teenagers. Brian Winchester stood beside Mike as his best man. Everything seemed perfect. Mike threw himself into his work with a dedication that bordered on obsession. He would come home for dinner with Denise, spend time with her, and then return to the office after she went to bed. When their daughter Ansley was born in 1999, Mike's devotion only deepened. He was a father who came alive around his child. Co-workers would see his face light up when he talked about her. He carried pictures. He rearranged his schedule to be present for the moments that mattered. By the year 2000, Mike Williams had built exactly the life he wanted. He was 31 years old, making an annual salary of $200,000. He and Denise owned a beautiful home in a small upscale subdivision on the east side of Tallahassee. They had a 1-year-old daughter, who was the light of both their lives. Mike had his career, his family, and his passion for those quiet mornings on the water. On paper everything was perfect, but beneath the surface, in the spaces Mike couldn't see, something dark was growing. October 13th, 1997, a Sister Hazel concert at Floyd's Music Store in downtown Tallahassee. Two couples arrived together, Mike and Denise Williams, Brian and Kathy Winchester. They had done this countless times before, going out together, enjoying music, being the friends they had always been. But that night, something changed. While Mike and Kathy went to park the car, Brian and Denise disappeared into the crowd. The lights were low, the music was loud, and in that darkness they kissed. It wasn't a mistake, it wasn't an accident, it was the beginning of something they would later call their anniversary. October 13th, 1997, the night their affair began. What started as stolen moments at a concert became an elaborate web of deception. Brian and Denise began meeting in secret. During her lunch breaks, she would leave work and meet him. They found places where they wouldn't be seen. Church parking lots, ironically enough, became favorite spots. The backs of parking lots at Home Depot and Kaiser University. Anywhere they could be alone. They were careful, calculated. They ran into Denise's sister once at a Tallahassee shopping mall, and had to play it cool. Another time, leaving a strip club in Panama City, they encountered a friend of Brian's who was heading inside. Each near miss only added to the thrill, the sense that they were getting away with something. Brian would later testify that they had sex as many as 15 times a week. They took secret trips to New York, to South Beach, to Destin. They created an entire hidden life that existed parallel to their real ones. When Mike called Brian to go hunting, Brian was there. When the four of them had dinner together, no one suspected a thing. Psychologists have a term for what allowed this to continue undetected: inattentional blindness, the idea that we don't see things we're not expecting to see, even when they're right in front of us. Mike Williams trusted his wife completely. He trusted his best friend without question. The thought that they might betray him wasn't just unlikely, it was impossible, and so he didn't see what was happening in plain sight. For 3 years the affair continued. Brian and Denise became more comfortable with their deception, more bold. They felt clever, special, like they had discovered something no one else understood. But as time went on, the situation became untenable. They wanted more than stolen hours and secret trips. They wanted a life together, a real life, out in the open, where they didn't have to hide. Brian, by his own admission, encouraged Denise to leave Mike, to get a divorce so they could be together. But Denise refused. Her family was deeply religious. Divorce was frowned upon, seen as a moral failure. More than that, Denise worried about custody. If she divorced Mike, she might have to share their daughter Ansley. She couldn't bear the thought of being away from her child for even part of the time. And so, according to Brian's later testimony, they began discussing other options. Options that didn't involve divorce. Options that would allow them to be together, to collect on Mike's life insurance policies, and to avoid the judgment of their community. They began planning murder. The first ideas were rejected. Staging a robbery at Mike's office seemed too complicated, too many variables. Denise suggested a boating accident in the Gulf of Mexico where both Mike and Kathy could fall overboard, but Brian refused. He didn't want to kill the mother of his children. Then Brian remembered something. A hunting trip he and Mike had taken to Arkansas. They had been walking through the woods when Mike suddenly sank into what seemed like quicksand, a mud hole that collapsed beneath his weight, pulling him down. Mike had panicked, scrambling for purchase, and Brian had helped pull him out. If Brian hadn't been there, Mike might have disappeared into that mud, and no one would have known what happened to him. That memory sparked an idea: a hunting accident. Something that would look natural, unavoidable. A tragedy that no one would question. In the spring of 2000, 6 months before Mike disappeared, Brian Winchester sold him a $1 million life insurance policy. Combined with the other policies Mike already had, his life was now insured for $1.75 million. The financial incentive was in place. Now they just needed the right opportunity. They chose a date, December 9th, 2000. Brian made plans with Mike to go hunting. Everything was set, but the night before the trip, Mike called Brian to cancel. Denise had told him he couldn't go. She had gotten cold feet at the last minute, unable to go through with it. For a week, Brian and Denise met in secret, discussing what to do. Should they abandon the plan? Should they try again? According to Brian's testimony, it was decided together. Yes, they would go through with it. They would kill Mike Williams. December 16th, 2000. A Saturday. The morning was dark and cold, the kind of cold that settles into your bones in North Florida during winter. Mike Williams woke before dawn, as he had done hundreds of times before. He moved quietly through his house on Centennial Oaks Circle, not wanting to wake Denise or baby Ansley. He had a busy weekend ahead. He and Denise were celebrating their 6th wedding anniversary. They had plans to drive down to Apalachicola that evening for a romantic getaway. But first, Mike wanted a few hours on the water. Just him, the lake, and the ducks. It was a gift he gave himself, a moment of peace before the celebrations began. Brian had told him about a secret hunting spot, somewhere special. Mike needed to bring his waders, Brian had said. Heavy rubber pants that went up to the chest, designed to keep a hunter dry and warm in cold water. Mike loaded his boat, hitched it to his 1994 Ford Bronco, and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness. Lake Seminole is a large reservoir, approximately 50 miles west-northwest of Tallahassee. It straddles the Georgia-Florida state line, a place where 3 streams merge to form the Apalachicola River. The lake is known for its tree stumps, old growth that was never cleared before the reservoir was created. These stumps jut out of the water like skeletal fingers, creating hazards for boats and perfect places for fish to eat. Mike met Brian at a parking lot. They drove separately to the lake, taking their own vehicles. This was unusual. Normally they would have driven together, talking on their cell phones during the drive. But Brian told Mike his phone battery was dead. He couldn't take calls. Mike didn't question it. Why would he? When they reached the lake, Brian convinced Mike to put on his waders before getting into the boat. It was cold, Brian said. Mike should put them on now, on dry land, rather than trying to get into them once they were on the water. Mike complied. He pulled on the heavy rubber waders, fastened them, and climbed into the boat with his best friend. They pushed off into the dark water. Brian later testified about what happened next. How he had planned to push Mike overboard, believing that the heavy waders would fill with water and drag him down. Mike would drown, and it would look like a tragic accident. A collision with a stump, perhaps. A fall into cold water. These things happened on Lake Seminole. But when Brian pushed Mike into the water, things didn't go as planned. Mike thrashed in the water, yes. He struggled against the weight of his jacket and the waders, but he managed to get the jacket off. He fought his way to one of those tree stumps and grabbed hold. He clung there in the dark water, calling out to Brian, confused, terrified, not understanding why his best friend had pushed him, but trusting that Brian would help him back into the boat. Brian panicked. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Mike was supposed to sink. He was supposed to drown quietly. Instead, he was holding on to that stump, very much alive, very much able to tell people what had happened. Brian picked up his shotgun. He loaded it. He piloted the boat closer to where Mike clung to the stump. And then, in the cold December darkness, with the first hints of dawn beginning to touch the eastern sky, Brian Winchester aimed his shotgun at Mike Williams' face and pulled the trigger. The sound must have echoed across the water, one single blast, and then silence. Mike Williams, 31 years old, father of a 1-year-old daughter, husband, son, friend, died in that moment, killed by the man he had trusted most in the world. But Brian's work wasn't finished. He pulled Mike's body from the water and back into the boat. He covered it with a tarp. Then he pushed Mike's boat back out into the lake, making it look as though it had been abandoned. He drove Mike's Bronco and boat trailer to a remote boat launch, parking them where searchers would find them. The scene was set to look like an accident. Then Brian drove his Suburban, with Mike's body in the back, all the way to Carr Lake, about an hour north of Lake Seminole. He stopped at a Walmart to buy a shovel and weights. He drove to a spot he remembered from previous hunts, a place with deep mud holes, and there on land owned by someone else, in a place where no one would think to look, Brian Winchester buried his best friend. He covered the body, he cleaned out his truck, he disposed of the shovel, and then he drove back to Tallahassee, where he went to a family Christmas party. There, surrounded by relatives celebrating the holiday season, Brian learned that a search had begun. Mike Williams hadn't come home. People were worried. Brian joined the search. He and his father took their boat out on Lake Seminole, calling Mike's name, acting concerned, playing the part of the worried friend. By noon on December 16th, Denise Williams called her father. Mike hadn't returned from his hunting trip. Something was wrong. Brian Winchester's father drove with Brian to the areas of Lake Seminole where they knew Mike liked to hunt. There, in a remote area of the lake, they found Mike's Bronco parked near a boat launch. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission was called. A search began. But the weather turned bad quickly. A storm rolled in, limiting what could be done that first day. When the weather cleared, searchers returned in force. A helicopter pilot spotted Mike's boat on the morning of December 17th. It was abandoned on the lake, floating about 225 feet from the boat ramp. Mike's shotgun was inside, still in its case. There was no sign of Mike. The search for Mike Williams became one of the most extensive in the area's history. Divers went down into the cold, murky water. They dragged the lake bed with equipment designed to find bodies. They used cadaver dogs. They employed a technique with PVC poles, pushing them down into the mud to feel for something soft, something that might be human remains rather than logs or stumps. For 56 days, teams searched Lake Seminole. They found a camouflage hunting hat, but it turned out not to be related to the case. They found nothing else. No body, no clothing, no evidence that Mike Williams had ever been in that water. This was unprecedented. Lake Seminole had seen drowning deaths before. Bodies had always been recovered. The lake wasn't so deep or so large that a body could simply vanish, and yet, Mike Williams had seemingly disappeared without a trace. The official theory began to take shape. Mike had collided with a stump. He had fallen from his boat into the cold water. The heavy waders in his jacket had dragged him down, and then alligators had consumed his remains. It was grim, but it made a certain kind of sense. Lake Seminole was home to thousands of alligators. Bodies don't last long in water with hungry reptiles. In February 2001, the active search was called off. Mike Williams was presumed dead, his body eaten by alligators. A memorial service was held. The community mourned. Life, as it always does, began to move forward. But one person refused to accept this explanation. Mike's mother, Cheryl Williams. Cheryl Williams knew her son. She had raised him from infancy, had watched him grow into a careful, skilled outdoorsman. Mike wasn't reckless. He didn't take unnecessary chances, and something about the official story didn't sit right with her. It felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate at first. Just a mother's instinct. a voice in her head that said, "No, this isn't what happened." A week after Mike disappeared, on Christmas Day, Cheryl visited Lake Seminole herself. She stood at the edge of the water, looking out at the place where her son supposedly died. And in that moment, she later said, she heard a voice. Not an audible voice, but something clear and certain in her mind. Mike is not in Lake Seminole. He did not drown. Cheryl began to investigate. She wasn't a detective. She had no law enforcement training. She was a daycare provider, a mother, a woman who refused to let her son's death be filed away and forgotten. She started taking notes, detailed, meticulous notes about everything she learned, everyone she talked to, every inconsistency she noticed. Eventually those notes would fill 27 single-spaced pages. One of the first things Cheryl did was contact an alligator expert. Matthew Oresco was a respected wildlife biologist. Cheryl asked him a simple question. Would alligators have eaten Mike's body in December? Oresco's answer was clear. No. Alligators don't feed in cold winter months. When water temperatures drop, their metabolism slows dramatically. They become lethargic. They don't hunt, and even when alligators do attack, there's always forensic evidence left behind. Blood, tissue, something. Cheryl took this information to authorities. She was brushed off. A fish and game officer told her, to her face, that he didn't like telling a mother her son had been eaten by alligators, but that's what happened. The case was closed. Cheryl didn't stop. She couldn't. She purchased billboard space around Tallahassee, large signs with Mike's picture and information about his disappearance. She took out advertisements in the Tallahassee Democrat, the local newspaper. She stood on street corners with handmade signs asking people for information. She handed out flyers at shopping centers and gas stations. Her former daughter-in-law, Denise, was furious. Approximately 9 months after Mike disappeared, Cheryl convinced the newspaper to write a story about the case. When the article was published, Denise called Cheryl and asked her to come over to her house. Cheryl arrived with her other son, Nick. Denise met them in the front yard. She didn't invite them inside. According to both Cheryl and Nick, Denise was livid, yelling. She told them that if they continued pushing for an investigation, they would never see Mike's daughter, Ansley, again. For Cheryl, this was devastating. Ansley was all she had left of Mike, her granddaughter who looked so much like her son. But Cheryl told Denise that she couldn't stop the investigation even if she wanted to. She had to know what happened to Mike. Denise followed through on her threat. She cut off all contact between the Williams family and Ansley. Cheryl, who had cared for her granddaughter in her home daycare, who had held her and loved her, and seen Mike's face and her features, was shut out completely. That little girl, who turned 19 on the day her mother was arrested, was effectively stolen from Mike's family. But Cheryl channeled her grief into action. She began writing letters to Florida's governor. One letter every single day. She wrote thousands of them over the years, asking the governor to assign a special investigator to Mike's case, to reopen the investigation, to not let her son's death be forgotten. The governor's office forwarded these letters to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, where they were apparently filed away. In 2004, 4 years after Mike disappeared, Cheryl's persistence finally paid off. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement agreed to reopen Mike Williams' case. It was launched as a multi-agency investigation. Detectives began looking at the evidence with fresh eyes, and they began to see the same inconsistencies Cheryl had noticed. The life insurance policies caught their attention immediately. Mike had 3 separate policies totaling $1.75 million. The largest policy, worth $1 million, had been purchased just 6 months before Mike disappeared, and it had been sold to him by his best friend Brian Winchester, who happened to be an insurance agent. Then there was the timeline of Mike's personal effects. 6 months after Mike vanished, His waders and hunting jacket suddenly appeared in Lake Seminole. They hadn't been there during the extensive search. Divers had been over every inch of that area. And suddenly, 6 months later, there they were. It looked suspiciously like someone had planted them, and the timing was significant. Finding these items helped Denise make her case that Mike was dead, not just missing, which allowed her to collect on the life insurance policies. Investigators learned something else. Brian Winchester and Denise Williams were seeing each other romantically. Some suspected it had been going on for years. And then in 2005, 5 years after Mike's death, Brian and Denise got married. They moved into the same house where Mike and Denise had lived. They were raising Ansley together in Mike's home. To everyone in Tallahassee, this looked suspicious. But suspicion isn't evidence. The investigation hit walls. There was no body, no physical evidence, no confession. Just questions and theories and a grieving mother who wouldn't give up. The investigation was opened and closed multiple times over the years. Each time, detectives came up empty. Each time, Cheryl's hopes were raised and then crushed. But she never stopped. She gave interviews to anyone who would listen. She appeared on the Investigation Discovery Channel show Disappeared in 2012. She picketed outside churches. She stood in public places with signs. She became, in the eyes of some, obsessive, eccentric. A mother who couldn't accept her son's death. But Cheryl knew something no one else seemed to grasp. She knew her son wasn't in that lake, and she knew with growing certainty that Denise was involved in whatever had happened to him. For years, Brian Winchester and Denise Williams lived their life in Tallahassee. To the outside world, they appeared to be a normal couple. Brian had his insurance business. Denise worked at Florida State University. They raised Ansley together. They attended church and social functions. They seemed, if not happy, at least stable. But beneath the surface, their relationship was crumbling. Brian would later testify about the paranoia that plagued them both. They believed they were being watched. Every time a car slowed down near their house, every time someone looked at them too long, they wondered if the police knew, if somehow, after all these years, their secret was going to come out. By 2010, the year Mike's case was officially reclassified as a suspicious death rather than an accidental drowning. Brian and Denise were estranged. They separated in 2012. 3 years later, in 2015, Denise filed for divorce. Brian didn't want the divorce. He had killed for this relationship. He had murdered his best friend to be with Denise, and now she wanted to leave him. It was unthinkable. Brian fought the divorce proceedings. He was ordered to provide an appraisal of their house by early August 2016. On August 5, 2016, something in Brian Winchester snapped. Denise left her home that morning to drive to her job at Florida State University. She was on the phone with her sister as she walked to her car. She got in, started talking, and then suddenly, someone climbed over the back seat. It was Brian. He had been hiding in her car, waiting for her. He snatched her phone away and began yelling directions at her. When Denise refused to comply, Brian showed her a gun. He told her that if she didn't do what he said, he would kill himself. He was desperate, unhinged, convinced that this was his last chance to keep her in his life. Denise kept her composure. Instead of following Brian's directions, she pulled into a CVS drugstore parking lot, close to the entrance where there would be cameras and witnesses. She managed to calm Brian down, got him to apologize for his behavior, and then, as soon as she could, she drove straight to the Leon County Sheriff's Office and reported what had happened. Brian Winchester was arrested and charged with kidnapping, domestic assault, and armed burglary, all felonies. He was held without bond, and suddenly, after 16 years, law enforcement had leverage they had never had before. Detectives who had been investigating Mike Williams' disappearance saw their opportunity. They began questioning both Brian and Denise about Mike's death. Denise refused to say anything. She invoked her right to remain silent and asked for a lawyer, but Brian was facing serious prison time. 20 years, potentially more. He was looking at the rest of his middle age behind bars, and worse, investigators suggested that if he didn't cooperate, if he didn't tell them what really happened to Mike Williams, they would make sure everyone knew that he had failed, that he had lost both Denise and his freedom. Brian's attorney worked out a deal with prosecutors. If Brian confessed to killing Mike Williams, if he led them to the body and told them everything, he would be granted immunity from murder charges. He would only be charged with the kidnapping. It was the only way out, the only path to salvaging anything from the wreckage of his life. In October 2017, Brian Winchester confessed. The confession was recorded. Played later in court, Brian's voice cracked with emotion as he described what he had done 17 years earlier. He admitted to the affair with Denise, said it had started in 1997 at that Sister Hazel concert. He described how they had planned to kill Mike, how they had rejected several ideas before settling on the hunting accident. He confirmed what investigators had suspected, that he had lured Mike to Lake Seminole under false pretenses, that he had convinced Mike to wear his waders, that he had pushed Mike into the water intending to drown him. And when that failed, when Mike managed to grab onto a tree stump and hold on, Brian described what happened next. I got him to stand up and I pushed him into the water. Brian's voice said on the tape, and he was in a panic. Obviously, I was in a panic. I didn't know what to do and I ended up shooting him. Where did he shoot him? In the head. Brian described loading Mike's body into his Suburban, driving to Carr Lake, a place he knew from other hunting trips, buying a shovel and weights at Walmart, finding a spot with deep mud holes and burying his best friend there, covering him so thoroughly that the body wouldn't be discovered for nearly 2 decades. Then Brian told investigators the part they needed most, the location. He led them to Carr Lake, to the exact spot where he had buried Mike Williams 17 years earlier. On October 18, 2017, a team of investigators and cadaver dogs descended on a wooded area near Carr Lake. The land was north of Tallahassee, about an hour from Lake Seminole. It was private property, covered in underbrush, far from any roads or homes, the kind of place where a body could lie undiscovered for decades. The dogs alerted in a specific area. Officers began to dig, and there, in piles of dirt stacked on plywood sheets, they found Mike Williams. 98% of his bones were recovered. They were remarkably well preserved. So were some of his clothes, the winter gloves and booties he had been wearing that December morning. And on one hand, still in place after all those years, was his wedding ring. DNA tests confirmed what everyone already knew. This was Mike Williams. This was Cheryl's son. The man who had supposedly been eaten by alligators hadn't been in Lake Seminole at all. For 17 years he had been buried an hour away, right where Brian Winchester had left him. The Florida Department of Law Enforcement announced that Mike Williams had been the victim of homicide. After 17 years of questions, Cheryl Williams finally had her answer. Her son hadn't drowned. He had been murdered. Brian Winchester's confession implicated Denise Williams at every turn. He testified that the affair had been going on since 1997, that they had planned the murder together, that Denise had been the one who couldn't accept divorce as an option because of her religious beliefs and her fear of losing custody of Ansley, that she had been involved in every step of the planning, every rejected idea, every refinement of their scheme. On May 8, 2018, Denise Williams was arrested at Florida State University. She was leaving work minutes away from celebrating her daughter Ansley's 19th birthday. When officers took her into custody, a grand jury had just indicted her on charges of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit first-degree murder, and accessory after the fact. Denise maintained her innocence. Her defense attorney, Philip Padovano, argued that the only evidence against Denise was the testimony of a confessed murderer and convicted kidnapper. Brian Winchester, he pointed out, had every reason to lie. Brian had kidnapped Denise when she tried to leave him. He was facing 20 years in prison. He had been granted immunity for murder in exchange for his confession, and he was bitter, angry that Denise had moved on, that she wanted a divorce. There's no tangible evidence or physical evidence to connect Denise Williams to this crime, Padovano told the jury. No confession, no admission, nothing. You will have to rely on the word of a murderer and a convicted felon. But the prosecution painted a picture of two people who had been, in Brian's words, like Bonnie and Clyde, partners in crime. They detailed the affair, the secret trips, the planning sessions. They showed that Denise had collected $1.5 million from Mike's life insurance policies, that she had married Brian 5 years after Mike's death, that she had threatened to cut off Mike's family from seeing Ansley if they continued pushing for an investigation. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and on December 14, 2018, the jury reached a verdict. Guilty. Denise Williams was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. At her sentencing in February 2019, Cheryl Williams addressed the court. She had waited 18 years for this moment. Her voice was thick with emotion as she described what her son's death had taken from her. Not just Mike, but her granddaughter too. The years she had spent fighting when everyone told her to give up. The nights she couldn't sleep, imagining Mike clinging to that tree stump in the dark, realizing his best friend was trying to kill him. I hear his voice screaming for help, Cheryl said. I wasn't there to help him. It will haunt me forever. Denise Williams was sentenced to life in prison. But the story doesn't end there. In 2020, Denise appealed her conviction. The appeals court overturned the first-degree murder charge, ruling that there wasn't enough evidence to prove Denise had been present at the lake when Mike was killed. The conspiracy charge, however, stood. In 2021, Denise was sentenced to 30 years in prison for conspiracy to commit murder. Brian Winchester never faced murder charges. The immunity deal protected him. He is serving 20 years in prison at Madison Correctional Institution for kidnapping Denise. His projected release date is sometime in the 2030s. As of today, no one has been convicted of Mike Williams' murder. Brian confessed but received immunity. Denise was convicted of conspiracy but not murder. In the eyes of the law, Mike Williams was killed by someone, but no one is serving time for that specific crime. There are no winners in this story, only degrees of loss. Cheryl Williams spent 17 years fighting for her son. She spent her retirement savings on billboards and private investigators. The stress damaged her health. She has trouble walking now, but she doesn't regret it. She gave Mike something he couldn't give himself: truth, justice, a proper burial. She got to lay her son to rest in a real grave, not just a spot in Lake Seminole where alligators supposedly ate him. But Cheryl lost her granddaughter in the process. Ansley Williams, now a grown woman, was raised by the two people who murdered her father. She has no relationship with her paternal grandmother, no connection to the Williams family. All the money from Mike's estate and his life insurance policies was signed over to Ansley in a deal that kept Denise from facing insurance fraud charges, but that money came at a terrible price. Ansley's father was murdered and she was raised by the people who did it, Brian Winchester's sister said in an interview. The weight of that reality is difficult to fathom. Mike Williams never got to see his daughter grow up, never got to walk her down the aisle or meet his grandchildren. He was 31 years old when he died, with so much life ahead of him. He died believing, in his last moments, that his best friend would help him, that surely this was all a terrible mistake, and Brian would pull him back into the boat, and everything would be okay. Lake Seminole still sits at the border between Florida and Georgia. Tree stumps still jut from the water. Hunters still go out in the pre-dawn hours, seeking that moment of peace before the sun rises. But the lake will forever be associated with Mike Williams, with the extensive search that found nothing. Please, if you're still awake and listening, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from, or just say I'm still here. And if you haven't yet, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. Now, let's move into our second story of the night. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a story that unfolded in the quiet corners of small-town Texas. A story about a young mother, a cold December night, and the darkness that can hide behind familiar faces. Our journey takes us to Graham, Texas, a small community where everyone knows everyone, where life moves at a slower pace, and where in the winter of 2011, a 20-year-old woman named Candace Shields simply vanished into the darkness. Graham, Texas sits in Young County, a place of open fields and wide skies. It's the kind of town where neighbors wave to each other from porches, where the local Whataburger is a gathering place, and where news travels fast through whispered conversations at the grocery store. In December of 2011, the holiday season was approaching. Christmas lights were beginning to appear on houses, and there was that particular chill in the air that comes to Texas in winter, not harsh but present, reminding you that even in the South, seasons change. Candace Renee Shields was known to her friends as Candy. She had brown hair that fell past her shoulders and striking green eyes that seemed to light up in photographs. She stood 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed around 130 pounds. At 20 years old, she was at that age where life feels both full of possibility and weighted with responsibility. Candace was a mother to a 1-year-old son. His name was Christopher, though some called him Chris. He was her world. Those who knew Candace well said she was devoted to her boy, that she would never willingly leave him, that her identity as a mother defined her in ways that went beyond words. And Candace was pregnant again, 3 to 4 months along, carrying new life, planning for a future with 2 children to love and raise. Her life had not been easy. Like many young people in small towns, Candace had experienced her share of turbulence. She had moved around, lived with different people, navigated complicated relationships. At 17, she had left her parents' home and moved in with a boyfriend named Billy Wilson and his family in nearby German, Texas. Christopher was Billy's son, but relationships shift like sand, and by late May of 2011, Candace and Billy had parted ways. She moved to Abilene to live with another man, Alan Faircloth. That relationship, too, proved temporary. By summer's end, Candace called Billy for a ride back to Graham. She moved in with her best friend, Missy Munn. In October of 2011, Candace moved in with friends named James and Misty Barnett. It was meant to be a fresh start, a stable place while she got back on her feet. She had just started working at the local Whataburger, beginning her shifts with hope for consistency, for routine, for building something solid. But on the very same day that Candace moved into the Barnett home, someone else moved in too. James Barnett's half-brother. His name was Jeremy Thornburg. Jeremy Paul Thornburg was 24 years old. He had connections to both Graham and Sweetwater, Texas, moving between the 2 towns as circumstances required. He was known in certain circles, had relationships that overlapped and intertwined in ways that would become significant. Within days of meeting Candace, Jeremy and she began a romantic relationship. It happened quickly, the way these things sometimes do. Two people in close quarters, attraction sparking, conversations late into the night. Within just a couple of weeks they announced that Candace was pregnant with Jeremy's child. The news rippled through their social circles. For Candace it meant planning for a future with two children from two different fathers. For Jeremy it meant another layer of complication in a life that was already tangled with multiple relationships. You see, Jeremy Thornburg was not exclusively with Candace. He had another girlfriend, a woman named Lawana Long. Lawana was 22 years old, and she and Jeremy shared a child together. They had lived together in Graham until September of 2011, around the time Jeremy met Candace. The situation was, to put it mildly, complicated. Jeremy was involved with both women. Candace was pregnant with his child. Lawana was deeply jealous of Candace and the pregnancy. According to later testimony, Lawana had even threatened Candace. The air between these three people crackled with tension, with unspoken resentments, with the kind of emotional volatility that can turn dangerous in an instant. Misty Barnett, who had opened her home to both Candace and Jeremy, eventually grew uncomfortable with Jeremy's presence. Something about him unsettled her. She asked him to leave, but Candace, caught in the complicated web of this relationship, stayed for a time. By December, Candace was living with her grandparents, Johnny and Betty Salinas. Their home was on Pearl Street, near Indiana Street, in a quiet neighborhood where families had lived for generations. It was meant to be a safe place, a place where Candace could focus on preparing for her second child, where Christopher could be cared for, where life could settle into something approaching normalcy. The evening of December 10th, 2011, was like many others in Graham. The temperature had dropped, and night came early, as it does in winter. Candace spent the evening at her grandparents' house. She was in good spirits, or so it seemed. She spent time on Facebook, scrolling through messages, staying connected with friends in that way that had become second nature to her generation. Johnny Salinas, her grandfather, said goodnight to Candace around 9:30 in the evening. It was the last time he would see her. What we know about the hours that followed comes from digital footprints, from cell phone records, from the ghostly traces we leave behind in our modern world. At 12:38 in the morning on December 11th, someone accessed Candace's Facebook page from her grandparents' home. She was active, messaging, scrolling. One of the people Candace communicated with that night was Jeremy Thornburg. They spoke several times. Phone records would later show multiple conversations between them in those late-night hours. According to testimony that would emerge much later, the conversations that night were not entirely peaceful. Jeremy suspected that Candace was seeing other men. He was jealous, possessive. Despite his own involvement with Lawana, they argued, their voices traveling through phone lines in the darkness. The last confirmed use of Candace's cell phone from inside the house was at 2:30 in the morning. A call was made. After that, the phone went silent. The back door of her grandparents' house was left unlocked. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of a struggle. The family's two dogs, who typically barked at unfamiliar sounds, remained quiet through the night. The neighbors heard nothing suspicious. When Johnny Salinas woke on the morning of December 11th to give his granddaughter a ride to work, he found her bedroom empty. At first he thought perhaps she had gone out. Candace was young, and sometimes young people make impulsive decisions. But as the minutes turned to hours, his concern deepened. Her cell phone was still on her bed. Her purse was in the room. Her makeup, which she never went anywhere without, sat untouched on the dresser. Her identification, her wallet, all of it remained behind. This was not like Candace. Those who knew her said she was, as her family later described, glued to her cell phone. She was an avid user of social media, constantly connected. For her to leave without her phone was unthinkable, and she was supposed to start her shift at Whataburger at 8 that morning. It was only her second day of work. She was trying to build stability, to earn money for her children. She would not have simply skipped work without a word. Johnny Salinas eventually hit redial on Candace's phone. The call connected to Missy Munn, Candace's best friend. Johnny explained his concerns, his growing fear. Missy came to the house immediately. Later that morning, Billy Wilson, Candace's ex-boyfriend and the father of Christopher, also arrived. Billy had never known Candace to leave without her phone, her purse, her makeup. The sight of all her belongings still in the bedroom filled him with dread. Billy called the Graham Police Department. The investigation into Candace Shields' disappearance had begun. Lieutenant Jim Reeves of the Graham Police Department took charge of the investigation. He was thorough, methodical, understanding that time was critical when someone goes missing. The first step was gathering information from Candace's friends and family. They painted a picture of a young woman who, despite the complications in her life, loved her son deeply and would not have abandoned him. The pregnancy made her disappearance even more concerning. Lieutenant Reeves examined Candace's cell phone. The data recovered from it revealed that in the days and weeks leading up to her disappearance, Candace had been in almost daily communication with several men: Billy Wilson, Alan Faircloth, Jeremy Thornburg, and possibly others. Texas Ranger Corey Lane joined the investigation, bringing additional resources and expertise. Together, Reeves and Lane began conducting interviews, trying to establish timelines, to understand where Candace might have gone. The day before her disappearance, Candace had allegedly received a threat from a co-worker at Whataburger. Police investigated this lead thoroughly, but nothing substantial emerged. It appeared to be a red herring, a distraction from the true circumstances. There was another strange detail. In the weeks before she disappeared, Candace had talked to her family and friends, asking hypothetically how they would feel if she left, if she just went away somewhere. This gave investigators brief hope that perhaps she had left voluntarily, that she might be alive somewhere, choosing to be absent. But as the days passed with no contact, that hope faded like morning fog under a harsh sun. Candace's family reported her officially missing on December 15, 2011, 4 days after she vanished. By then the trail was growing cold. Lieutenant Reeves and Ranger Lane turned their attention to the men in Candace's life. Alan Faircloth and Billy Wilson both had verified alibis for the night of December 10th into the 11th. They could not have been involved. That left Jeremy Thornburg. On December 15th, Lieutenant Reeves called Jeremy for a phone interview. Jeremy claimed he had been in Sweetwater on the night Candace disappeared. He said he didn't have gas money to drive to Graham. He maintained his innocence, his voice calm over the phone. But investigators were not convinced. They continued digging, pulling phone records, examining patterns of communication. Meanwhile, Candace's family refused to give up. They organized their own searches, walking through fields and abandoned areas around Graham, calling her name, hoping against hope to find some sign of her. They held candlelight vigils, distributed flyers with her photograph and description, pleaded on social media for anyone with information to come forward. Michelle Quillen, Candace's mother, spoke to reporters, her voice breaking with desperation. She begged Candace, if she could hear, to just let them know she was safe, even if she didn't want to come home, even if she was hiding for reasons they didn't understand, just a sign, just a word that she was alive. The holidays came and went. Christmas passed without Candace. New Year arrived, marking the transition into 2012. Christopher grew older, asking questions that had no good answers. Where was his mother? When would she come home? Months stretched into a year. The investigation continued, but publicly there seemed to be little progress. The Graham Police Department worked leads, followed tips, but Candace remained missing. And then finally, more than a year after her disappearance, investigators found the breakthrough they needed. The evidence that ultimately led to arrests came from multiple sources, pieced together slowly, painstakingly. First, there was the gun. Jeremy Thornburg owned a firearm, and investigators obtained it for forensic analysis. A forensic scientist named Brent Hester examined the weapon carefully. He performed tests on what appeared to be stains on the underside of the gun. One stain was almost invisible to the naked eye, less than 1 millimeter in diameter. But the test came back positive. It was blood, and DNA analysis revealed that the blood matched Candace Shields. This was damning evidence. How did Candace's blood end up on Jeremy's gun? Second, investigators examined cell phone records more closely. They found that Jeremy's phone records contradicted his alibi, despite his claim that he had been in Sweetwater on the night of Candace's disappearance. Phone tower data showed his phone had been in the Graham area. There was also evidence that after Candace's disappearance, someone had accessed her phone and deleted specific messages and call logs. The deletions were selective, surgical. Investigators believe Jeremy had taken Candace's phone after whatever happened to her, removed incriminating evidence, and then returned the phone to her grandparents' house. That would explain why the phone was left behind. It had been cleaned of evidence and placed back in her bedroom. Third, there was testimony from people close to Jeremy and Lawana. A woman named Jessica Cortez, who shared a trailer with Jeremy and Lawana, noticed something odd in the days after Candace's disappearance. Bleach was missing from their home. Not just a little, a significant amount, enough to be noticeable. Why would someone suddenly need a large quantity of bleach? The pieces were coming together, but investigators needed more. They needed someone on the inside to break. In February of 2013, more than a year after Candace vanished, authorities arrested Jeremy Paul Thornburg. He was taken into custody in Abilene and transported to the Young County Jail. His bond was set at $750,000. A press conference was held. Texas Department of Safety officials announced that new information confirmed Jeremy had traveled to Candace's home on the evening of December 10th, and that Candace had left with him in the early morning hours of December 11th. The case was no longer just a missing person investigation. It was now a murder investigation, even though Candace's body had not been found. Days later, in late February 2013, a second arrest was made. Lawana Long was taken into custody and charged with murder in connection with Candace's death. Her bond was also set at $750,000. The arrests brought a mixture of emotions to Candace's family: relief that someone would be held accountable, anguish that their worst fears were being confirmed, frustration that Candace's body still had not been recovered. Lieutenant Reeves and Ranger Len interviewed Lawana Long multiple times. At first, she claimed to know nothing. In her initial interview back in 2011, she had told investigators she worked with Candace at Whataburger, but denied having any information about her whereabouts. In her second interview, after Jeremy's arrest in 2013, Lawana changed her story slightly. She said she had heard that Candace had moved to Oklahoma in December 2011, but investigators knew she was lying. Ranger Lane confronted her, told her directly that he didn't believe her, and then finally in March of 2013, during her third interview, Lawana broke. She confessed that she knew what had happened to Candace Shields. She knew where the body could be found. The story that Lawana Long told was chilling in its simplicity and brutality. She testified that on the night of December 10th, going into the early morning of December 11th, Jeremy contacted Candace. He asked her to meet him. Despite everything, the complications, the jealousy, the arguments, Candace agreed. According to LaWanna, Jeremy picked Candace up from her grandparents' house in the early morning hours. Sometime after 2:30, they drove together out of Graham, heading toward the open fields that stretch between Graham and Breckenridge. These are lonely places, especially at night, dark expanses where the only light comes from a scattered farmhouse or the distant glow of a town miles away. The kind of place where you can be completely alone, where no one will hear a sound. Once they were isolated in one of these fields, Jeremy shot Candace. The gunshot would have echoed across the empty land, but there was no one to hear it, no witnesses, just the cold December air and the darkness. LaWanna testified that she was present for what happened next. After Jeremy killed Candace, they poured bleach over her body. The chemical would destroy DNA evidence, make it harder for investigators to find forensic proof. It was a calculated act, an attempt to cover up the crime. LaWanna later claimed that she did not participate in the actual murder, that she had not pulled the trigger, that she had been present but not active. She testified that Jeremy had planned to kill Candace, and that she had known about his plans but did not stop him. Whether this was the complete truth or a version shaped to minimize her own culpability, we cannot know with certainty. What is clear is that both Jeremy and LaWanna were involved in Candace's death. LaWanna agreed to plead guilty to murder in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Part of the agreement was that she would testify against Jeremy Thornburg at his trial. Jeremy's family members also provided testimony that would prove crucial. Jeremy's brother, Jimmy Thornburg, told authorities that Jeremy had confessed to him. Jeremy had described where he shot and killed Candace. At first, Jimmy didn't believe him. It seemed too horrible, too unthinkable. But when Jeremy was arrested, Jimmy realized his brother had been telling the truth. Investigators searched the area that Jimmy indicated, the field between Graham and Breckenridge. They combed through the terrain, looking for any sign of Candace's remains. They found nothing. Jeremy's mother, Lachelle Doolittle, also testified. She said that Jeremy had been living with her in Sweetwater around the time of Candace's disappearance. One morning she went to her car to drive to church and discovered that the gas tank was empty, even though she had filled it with gas the day before. Someone had used her car, driven somewhere and back, depleting an entire tank of gas. The distance from Sweetwater to Graham and back would require precisely that amount of fuel. When Lachelle heard that Candace was missing, she later admitted she had thoughts that her son might have been involved. A mother's intuition, dark and terrible. In October of 2014, nearly 3 years after Candace vanished, Jeremy Paul Thornburg's trial began. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented the cell phone records showing Jeremy's presence in Graham. On the night of the disappearance, they introduced the gun with Candace's blood on it. They called LaWanna Long to the stand to testify about what happened in that field. Jessica Cortez also testified. She told the jury that Jeremy had confessed to her that he had killed Candace. However, she changed her story 3 times over the course of the investigation, which created complications for the prosecution. Defense attorneys seized on these inconsistencies, questioning her reliability. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that a spot of blood on a gun was not proof of murder, that LaWanna's testimony was unreliable because she had struck a deal with prosecutors. But the jury heard the totality of the evidence: the lies Jeremy had told about his whereabouts, the blood on the gun, the missing bleach, the deleted phone records, the testimony of multiple witnesses who described Jeremy's suspicious behavior, and contradictory statements. The trial lasted several days. Candace's family sat in the courtroom, watching, waiting for justice. On October 21, 2014, Both sides rested their cases. The jury deliberated, and then they returned with their verdict: guilty of murder. Jeremy Paul Thornburg was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Candace's family wept tears of relief mixed with profound grief. They had justice, yes, but Candace was still gone. Her body had not been found. Christopher would grow up without his mother. The child Candace had been carrying when she died would never be born. At the sentencing, Candace's stepfather read an emotional letter to the court, addressed to Jeremy. It spoke of the pain the family had endured for the past 3 years, the sleepless nights, the endless hoping and searching, the agony of not knowing. Michelle Quillen, Candace's mother, told reporters after the trial that while they hadn't expected the jury to sentence Jeremy to life in prison, they were grateful. "We got it," she said simply. But there was still something missing, something that weighed on the family every single day. To this day, Candace Shields' body has never been found. Despite extensive searches, despite Luana's testimony about the location, despite law enforcement's best efforts, the fields between Graham and Breckenridge have kept their secret. Texas is vast. The rural areas around Graham stretch for miles, filled with fields, ravines, abandoned structures. The bleach that was poured over Candace's remains would have accelerated decomposition, making it even more difficult to locate her. For Candace's family, the absence of a body means there can never be complete closure. They cannot lay her to rest in a grave with a headstone. They cannot visit a specific place to remember her, to leave flowers, to feel close to her spirit. Every field they pass might be the one. Every search that turns up nothing is another wound reopened. The Graham Police Department and Texas Rangers have stated they will continue searching as new information becomes available. Volunteers occasionally organize search parties, walking through areas that haven't been thoroughly explored. A Facebook page dedicated to Candace remains active, maintained by friends and family who refuse to let her be forgotten. They share updates, memories, photographs of Candace smiling with her beautiful green eyes, holding Christopher, living her short life. Jeremy Thornburg is serving his life sentence in a Texas prison. LaSwana Long is serving her 30-year sentence. Both will spend decades behind bars for what they did on that December night. But Candace is still out there, somewhere in the Texas landscape. Her son Christopher is now in his early teens, growing up with only photographs and stories to know his mother. The child she was pregnant with would have been around 11 or 12 years old now had they been born. Michelle Quillen, Candace's mother, continues to advocate for missing persons cases, channeling her grief into helping others navigate the nightmare of having a loved one vanish. The pain never fully goes away, she says, but you learn to carry it differently. Johnny Salinas, the grandfather who last said goodnight to Candace, still lives in the house on Pearl Street. Sometimes, late at night, he wonders if he could have done something different, if there was a moment he missed, a warning sign that could have changed everything. But the truth is, no one in that house could have known what was waiting in the darkness outside their door. No one could have predicted that when Candace slipped out through the unlocked back door to meet Jeremy Thornburg, she was walking toward her death. The case of Candace Shields is a reminder that tragedy can strike anywhere, even in small towns that feel safe, even among people you know, even when you think you're making a simple decision like meeting someone you've been in a relationship with. It's a story about jealousy and control, about how toxic relationships can turn deadly, about the danger that can lurk behind familiar faces. But it's also a story about a family's love and determination, about a community that came together to search for one of their own, about law enforcement officers who refused to give up, who worked for more than a year to build a case that would bring justice. Candace Shields was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a granddaughter, a mother, a friend. She had dreams for her future, plans for raising her children, hopes that she would find stability and happiness. Those dreams were stolen from her on a cold December night in 2011. But her memory lives on, and Christopher, who carries pieces of his mother in his face and mannerisms, in the Facebook page that keeps her story alive, in every true crime story that is told, reminding us to be vigilant, to trust our instincts, to look out for one another. And somewhere in those wide Texas fields, beneath the stars and the endless sky, Candace Shields rests in an unmarked place, waiting to be brought home. That's the story of Candace Shields, a case that remains open in one critical way. The search for her remains continues. If you have any information about the location of Candace's body, the Graham Police Department asks that you contact them. Even after all these years, bringing Candace home would mean the world to her family. Please, if you're still with me, let me know in the comments. Tell me the time in your corner of the world, or just say something to show you're still awake. And remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy these midnight stories. Alright, let's continue with our third story. Story 3. Tonight we're going to journey together through a story, one that's both troubling and important. This is a tale of a young woman named Tamika, a life full of promise and the search for truth that would shine a light on stories too often left in shadow. We're traveling back to the spring of 2004, to a small city in South Carolina called Spartanburg, where magnolia trees bloom white against the southern sky, and where a 24-year-old woman was about to vanish from the life she'd built. This is the story of Tamika Houston. Tamika Antoinette Houston was born on December 11, 1979, under the soft winter light of a South Carolina December. From the very beginning, there was something luminous about her. Those who knew her would later say she had a way of lighting up a room, not with loudness or spectacle, but with warmth, with presence, with the kind of genuine smile that made people feel seen. She grew up in Spartanburg, a city nestled in the foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains, where the air in springtime carries the scent of fresh pine and honeysuckle. Her parents, Gabriella Simonahi and Anthony Houston, separated when she was young, but Tamika never lacked for love. She was surrounded by family, her younger sister Antonia, her half-siblings, cousins, aunts, and uncles. Extended family gatherings filled her childhood with laughter and belonging. Tamika's aunt, Rebecca Howard, was only 7 years older than her niece. They weren't just aunt and niece, they were friends, confidantes, almost like sisters. Rebecca would remember Tamika as warm, as wonderful, as someone whose absence would leave an incredible void. As Tamika grew into young adulthood, she carried dreams like seeds waiting to bloom. She had a beautiful singing voice, and once, filled with hope and courage, she traveled to Atlanta to audition for American Idol. Though she didn't make it past the early rounds, the experience didn't diminish her spirit. She was resilient, adaptable, always looking toward the next chapter. By 2004, Tamika had found her calling. She enrolled in nursing school, ready to dedicate herself to caring for others. At 24 years old, she owned her own home, a modest white frame house on Harvard Drive in Spartanburg. For a young woman, living alone, supporting herself through school and work as a waitress, this was no small achievement. She had independence, ambition, and a future that seemed bright with possibility. Tamika was a private person, someone who valued her autonomy. She came and went as she pleased, sometimes taking spontaneous road trips without telling anyone, disappearing for a few days just to clear her head or explore. Friends and family had learned to accept this about her. She was a free spirit, someone who didn't like to be monitored or confined. And she had one great love in her life during this time. Her dog, Macy. Macy was a pit bull, loyal and gentle, and Tamika treated her like a child. She doted on her, made sure she was fed and loved and never alone. Everyone who knew Tamika knew this about her. She would never ever abandon Macy. This was the woman Tamika Houston was in the spring of 2004. A nursing student with dreams of helping others. A young homeowner building a life for herself. A devoted dog mom. A beloved daughter, sister, niece, and friend. And then, as May turned warm and the semester came to a close, Tamika disappeared. It's difficult to pinpoint the exact moment Tamika vanished, because she lived alone and kept her own schedule, because she was between semesters at nursing school and had recently quit her waitressing job, because she was known for her spontaneous trips. No one immediately noticed when she stopped answering her phone. The days passed quietly. Late May became early June. Calls went unreturned. Text messages sat unread. But this in itself wasn't unusual for Tamika. It was around June 14, 2004 when concern finally crystallized into alarm. Rebecca Howard, her aunt, realized that she hadn't heard from Tamika in far too long. Neither had Tamika's mother, Gabriella. The silence felt wrong, heavy with absence. Rebecca contacted the Spartanburg Police Department. Officers were dispatched to Tamika's house on Harvard Drive. From the outside, nothing seemed amiss. The house sat quiet. The front door locked. Tamika's black 1991 Honda CRX was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps she really had just taken off on one of her trips. But when officers gained entry through an open window, they discovered a scene that transformed worry into dread. Inside the house, the air was stale and still. Tamika's cell phone lay abandoned. Her driver's license remained on a table. 3 uncashed checks sat waiting. Money Tamika needed. Money she never would have left behind if she'd gone somewhere voluntarily. And then there was Macy. The pregnant pit bull was found emaciated, desperate, barely surviving. Her water bowl was bone dry, her food bowl empty. In her distress and starvation, Macy had given birth to her litter of puppies, and in the terrible mathematics of survival, she had eaten most of them. The scene was heartbreaking, and it told investigators everything they needed to know. The dog had drunk water from the toilet, anything to survive. Tamika had been gone a long time, and she had not left by choice. Police noted the condition of the toilet water, the desperation written in every corner of that house. The woman who treated Macy like her child would never have left her to suffer like this. Something terrible had happened. They canvassed the neighborhood, distributed hundreds of flyers with Tamika's picture, a young woman with sparkling eyes and a wide, friendly smile. Her face looked out from telephone poles and store windows asking, "Have you seen me?" Rebecca Howard, working in public relations, understood the power of media attention. She began reaching out to news organizations, sending press releases, making phone calls, trying desperately to amplify her niece's story. Surely, she thought, a young, beautiful nursing student who had vanished. Surely this would capture attention. Surely someone would help. But the response was silence. The spring and summer of 2004 were consumed by other stories. The news cycle churned with cases that captivated the nation. The trial in the Lacey Peterson case, where a pregnant woman had been murdered by her husband. The disappearance of Natalie Holloway in Aruba. And then in late April and early May, the bizarre saga of the runaway bride, Jennifer Wilbanks, who disappeared before her wedding only to be found days later, having fled her own ceremony. These stories dominated headlines. Cable news ran them around the clock. Search parties were organized. Rewards were offered. The nation watched, captivated. And in Spartanburg, South Carolina, Rebecca Howard made call after call, sent email after email, and hit what she would later describe as a brick wall. In my mind I'm thinking, well, here's my niece, she would recall. She's young, she's beautiful, she's missing. Her story is just as compelling. The only difference is that Tamika's black, Natalie Holloway is white. Journalist Tiffany D. Cross, then a young producer at America's Most Wanted, would later explain what it was like working in newsrooms during that time. In the early 2000s, there was a lot of missing white women that got outsized attention, and it was very frustrating to be a black woman working in newsrooms. It didn't work that way for the amount of missing black people. The disparity was stark, undeniable. Tamika Houston's case received virtually no national coverage. Her family's anguish played out in near silence while the media machine churned elsewhere. But in Spartanburg, the police did not give up. About a week after Tamika was reported missing, on June 20th, residents of the Barksdale Apartments on Pierpont Avenue noticed something. In the parking lot sat a black Honda CRX, abandoned, out of place. They called the police. It was Tamika's car. Investigators descended on the vehicle, hoping for the treasure trove of evidence that might unlock the mystery. They processed every surface, every corner, but the car had been cleaned, deliberately stripped of most clues. They found a partial fingerprint that didn't match anyone in the national database, and they found something else, a set of keys on the passenger side floorboard. These keys didn't belong to Tamika. They didn't fit her car. They didn't open her house, but one of them had a peculiar engraving. For days this marking meant nothing. It was a code without context, a locked door without any idea where to find it. But then, patient detective work paid off. A locksmith who had worked in Spartanburg for decades recognized the engraving. It was his marking system, and he could trace exactly which lock that key belonged to. The key opened an apartment at the Fremont School Apartments. The investigators' attention sharpened. The apartment complex management explained their system. When a tenant was evicted, maintenance would simply swap out the doorknobs for security purposes. This meant that key could have belonged to anyone who'd lived in that unit recently. They compiled a list of former tenants, and one name stood out. Meanwhile, investigators had been pursuing other leads. Tamika's ex-boyfriend Terrence Moss had initially been a person of interest. He and Tamika had lived together until March 2004, just a few months before her disappearance. Their relationship had been troubled. Tamika had been scheduled to testify against him in an assault case just 2 weeks after she vanished. But Terrence came forward voluntarily, offering his full cooperation. "You're only scared of the police when you've done something wrong," he told investigators. "I didn't do anything wrong. I told them everything." His alibi checked out. He was eventually cleared of suspicion. Tamika's best friend Zelda Teamer provided another crucial piece of information. Tamika had recently started dating someone new, she said. Someone she'd brought by for a casual visit earlier in the year. He had been standoffish, quiet. Zelda had asked, "Where did he come from?" Tamika had replied simply, "Oh, he's just my friend." His name was Chris. It was the last time Zelda would see her friend alive. Now, as investigators cross-referenced their list of former tenants from the apartment with the key marking, that name appeared again, Christopher Lamont Hampton. Christopher Hampton was 25 years old. In 2004, he had a criminal record, a federal conviction for bank robbery for which he'd served time. He was currently on parole when Tamika disappeared, and in fact he had violated that parole and was incarcerated again by December of that year. But back in May, he had been living in apartment 215 at the Fremont School Apartments, the very unit that the key from Tamika's car could unlock. In December 2004, investigators questioned Hampton while he was in custody on the parole violation. Did he know Tamika Houston? Yes, he admitted. They had dated briefly, maybe 2 or 3 months. Did he know where she was? No, he claimed. He had no knowledge of her whereabouts or the circumstances of her disappearance. The interview led nowhere. Hampton denied everything, and without concrete evidence, the investigators could do little but continue searching. Then, in January 2005, they obtained a search warrant for Hampton's old apartment. What they found changed everything. The apartment at Fremont School had been vacant for months. When investigators entered, they began their methodical examination, looking for fibers, prints, biological evidence, anything that might connect this space to Tamika Houston's disappearance. In the bedroom, they noticed something on the carpet, a large stain, and the chemical scent that still lingered months later told them what it was. Bleach. Someone had doused this carpet with cleaning supplies. Trey Gowdy, the Spartanburg solicitor at the time, would later say with grim humor, "The investigators found a really big bleach stain, which is Latin for, 'I'm covering something up.' They cut out sections of the carpet and sent them for testing. Despite the attempts to clean it, blood had seeped deep into the fibers, into the padding beneath. And when the DNA results came back, they confirmed what investigators suspected. It was Tamika Houston's blood. This was the breakthrough the case needed. But Tamika herself was still missing. Her family still had no answers. And Christopher Hampton, sitting in jail on unrelated charges, remained silent. Then something else happened. A piece of evidence arrived that would seal Hampton's fate. Hampton had mailed his wallet to his ex-girlfriend for safekeeping. While he was incarcerated, the ex-girlfriend who was also the mother of his child. When she examined the wallet, she found something that made her blood run cold. A photograph, stained with what appeared to be blood. She did what must have been an impossibly difficult thing. She took the photo to the police. Forensic testing confirmed it. The blood on the photograph matched Tamika Houston's DNA. Nearly a year after Tamika vanished, Rebecca Howard's persistence finally bore fruit. Through her relentless advocacy and the help of Tiffany D. Cross at America's Most Wanted, Tamika's case was featured on the show in the spring of 2005. The national exposure prompted something crucial. An anonymous caller came forward. A 15-year-old girl told investigators that she had been inside apartment 215 around the time of Tamika's disappearance. She had been there with Hampton, and she had seen things that disturbed her. A brownish-red stain on the bedroom carpet, a dresser pushed in front of the closet as if hiding something. The evidence was mounting, irrefutable and damning. Christopher Hampton was scheduled to be released from his parole violation on August 12, 2005. He never walked free. On the morning of August 12, 2005, as Christopher Hampton prepared to leave custody, Spartanburg public safety officers approached him with a murder warrant. More than 15 months after Tamika Houston disappeared, Hampton was formally charged with her murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Her blood in his apartment, her blood on the photograph in his wallet, the key to his apartment found in her abandoned car, witness testimony placing him with her around the time she vanished. After hours of interrogation, Christopher Hampton confessed. The story he told was one of anger, of impulse, of a moment that spiraled into horror and deception. According to Hampton, on May 27, 2004, Tamika came to his apartment. He was ironing clothes, getting ready for work. They began to argue about money. Hampton was involved with another woman at the time, a woman who was pregnant with his child. He claimed he was trying to save money for the baby. When Tamika asked him for money and he refused, the argument escalated. "You care about the baby more than you care about me," Tamika said, and something inside Christopher Hampton snapped. He threw the hot iron at her. The heavy appliance, heated to hundreds of degrees, struck Tamika in the head with brutal force. She fell to the floor, unconscious. Within moments, She was dead. Hampton claimed he didn't mean for it to hit her, that it was an accident born of rage, but investigators would later note discrepancies in his account. Some reports suggested he had struck her directly rather than thrown the iron in her general direction. Either way, the result was the same. Tamika Houston, 24 years old, a nursing student with her whole life ahead of her, lay dead in Christopher Hampton's bedroom. What happened next revealed not panic and remorse, but calculated concealment. After Tamika died, Christopher Hampton wrapped her body in a comforter and hid it in the bedroom closet. He pushed a dresser in front of the door, the same oddity the 15-year-old girl would later notice. He went to a neighbor and borrowed bleach, then methodically cleaned the carpet where Tamika had fallen. He scrubbed and doused the bloodstain, trying to erase all evidence of what had happened. And then, according to his confession, he drank beer, and in an act of almost incomprehensible callousness, he brought another woman into that same bedroom and had sex with her, while Tamika's body lay hidden just feet away in the closet. The next day, Hampton borrowed a friend's car. He carefully placed Tamika's body in the vehicle and drove around Spartanburg for hours, trying to decide what to do with her. Eventually, he headed west, driving 13 miles to a wooded area near the small town of Duncan, off Tiger River Drive. The area was secluded, dense with trees and undergrowth. It was the kind of place where something or someone could remain hidden for a very long time. Hampton dug a shallow grave and buried Tamika's body. Before covering the grave completely, he broke 2 branches from nearby trees and arranged them in the shape of a cross, marking the spot where he had left her. In the days and weeks that followed, as Tamika's family frantically searched for her, as flyers with her picture appeared all over Spartanburg, as her aunt begged the media to pay attention, Christopher Hampton said nothing. He was arrested in June 2004 on a parole violation, unrelated to Tamika's disappearance, a minor traffic offense. While in custody, he saw news reports about the search for Tamika. He saw her family's desperate pleas. According to Hampton, guilt consumed him. In July 2004, after his release from the short jail stay, he returned to the burial site. He claimed he went there thinking he might dig up the body and turn himself in. Instead, he made the situation even more horrific. He exhumed Tamika's remains. Using a tool he had brought, he removed her head, placed it in a plastic grocery bag, and disposed of it in a garbage dumpster somewhere in Spartanburg. Then he reburied the rest of her body in the same location, perhaps hoping that without the ability to identify her, he might escape justice. He was wrong. On August 12, 2005, after confessing to the murder, Christopher Hampton agreed to lead police to Tamika's remains. They drove to Duncan, to the wooded area of Tiger River Drive. Hampton directed them through the trees to a spot that would have been nearly impossible to find otherwise. There, in a shallow grave marked by 2 crossed branches, investigators found what was left of Tamika Houston. The Spartanburg County coroner used DNA testing and dental records to confirm the identity. After 15 months of desperate searching, of hoping against hope, Tamika's family finally had their answer. Their beloved Tamika was gone. For Gabriela Simina Maishi, Tamika's mother, the news brought both crushing grief and a measure of grim relief. For our family, this day brings us both tremendous sadness and some sense of relief, the family said in a statement, while trying to come to terms with the fact that our Tamika will not return to us. We find comfort in knowing the person responsible for this most personal tragedy is being brought to justice. Rebecca Howard described her emotions more directly. I'm angry and I'm still grieving. The heinousness of it is unbelievable. Christopher Hampton's trial was scheduled to begin on April 3, 2006, but on the morning the trial was set to start, Hampton entered a guilty plea to murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge John Few made clear that Hampton would serve every single day of that sentence. During his interactions with the media and police, Hampton expressed what he claimed was remorse. He told reporters, "I know I'm a good person." It was a statement that rang hollow to those who knew what he had done: the violence, the concealment, the desecration of Tamika's body, the months of silence while her family suffered. Today, Christopher Hampton remains incarcerated in the Broad River Correctional Institution of the South Carolina Department of Corrections, where he will spend the rest of his life. But Tamika Houston's story didn't end with her killer's conviction. Her case, and specifically the lack of national media attention it received, became a catalyst for change. It helped lead to the creation of the Black and Missing Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to bringing awareness to missing persons of color, whose cases too often go overlooked. Rebecca Howard joined the foundation's board of directors, transforming her grief into advocacy. She works to ensure that other families don't face the same silence her family encountered. Actor and activist Erica Alexander, best known for her role in the 1990s sitcom Living Single, created an award-winning audio series called Finding Tamika, which brought renewed attention to the case. Alexander told interviewers, "I know how much black girls don't matter, and I want to always be a reflection of how much value they had to me. So of course she mattered to me. Because of Houston's story," Alexander said, "we are looking for black and brown girls." Tiffany D. Cross, the producer who helped get Tamika's case on America's Most Wanted, has continued to speak out about disparities in missing persons coverage, using her platform to advocate for equal attention to all missing persons, regardless of race. Tamika's case has been featured on multiple true crime programs, including Forensic Files, in an episode titled Skeleton Key, and on ABC's 2020 in an episode called The Girl Who Looked Like Me. Tamika's mother, Gabriella, and her sister, Antonia, who now goes by the name Red Houston, continue to live in Spartanburg. Antonia has become a successful entrepreneur, running a boutique and salon called the Dollhouse 83. But the tragedy that began in May 2004 cast a long shadow over the family. In 2017, 13 years after Tamika's death, another heartbreak struck. Tamika's father, Anthony Houston, and his wife were found dead in their home in Moore, South Carolina, in what authorities determined was a murder-suicide. The reasons remain unclear, but those who knew the family wondered if the weight of losing Tamika had never truly lifted. So much loss, so much grief. One young woman's murder sent ripples of pain through generations. And so we come to the end of this story tonight. The story of Tamika Antoinette Houston, born December 11, 1979, died May 27, 2004. She was 24 years old. She was a nursing student, with dreams of helping others. She was a daughter who was loved, a sister who was cherished, a niece who was adored, a friend who was valued, a woman who loved her dog like a child. She was a person who mattered, whose life had value, whose story deserved to be told. The circumstances of Tamika's death were brutal. The concealment of her murder was cruel. The silence that initially greeted her disappearance was unjust. But through the determination of her family, through the persistence of advocates, through the work of dedicated investigators, Tamika's story has been told. Her killer was brought to justice, and her legacy has become a catalyst for change, a reminder that every missing person deserves attention, every family deserves answers, and every life holds equal worth. In Spartanburg, South Carolina, people still remember the young woman with the sparkling eyes and the warm smile. They remember the injustice of the silence that greeted her disappearance, and they remember what her story taught them about whose stories get told and whose are left in shadow. Tamika Houston's story matters, not just as a true crime case, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reminder of a real person who lived and loved and dreamed and died too young. May she rest in peace. May her family find what comfort they can, and may we all remember that behind every case, every headline, every statistic, there is a person, someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend, someone who mattered. Please, if you haven't drifted off yet, check in with me. Tell me which story has been the most chilling so far, the first, the second, or the third. And if you're enjoying these stories, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's move on to story number 4. Story 4. Tonight we'll journey through a story that tests the boundaries of human endurance and resilience. This is a tale that spans 18 years, a story of darkness and light, of loss and miraculous return. This is the story of J.C. Lee Dugard. The morning of June 10, 1991, began like any other in the small mountain community of Myers, California, just south of South Lake Tahoe. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine trees that carpeted the Sierra Nevada foothills. It was the kind of place where families moved seeking safety, seeking peace, seeking a better life for their children. J.C. Lee Dugard was 11 years old that summer morning. Born on May 3, 1980, she was a typical fifth grader with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a face dusted with freckles. She lived with her mother, Terry, her stepfather, Carl Probin, and her baby sister, Shayna, who had been born just the year before. The family had moved to this quiet mountain town from Southern California in September of 1990, drawn by the promise of small-town security. JC was excited that June morning there was a field trip coming up at school, something she'd been looking forward to. It was a Monday, and the school bus stop was just a short walk up the hill from her home, maybe 150 yards, close enough that her stepfather could watch her walk there from their property. Carl Probin was in the garage that morning. He watched as JC made her way up the slight incline toward the bus stop, her pink outfit bright in the morning sun. Pink was her favorite color. The whole town would soon learn this fact, as pink ribbons would eventually blanket the community in her honor. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A gray sedan pulled up alongside JC. Carl heard his stepdaughter scream. He looked up to see a man and a woman grabbing the young girl, pulling her into their vehicle. Carl jumped on his bicycle and pedaled furiously, chasing the car as it sped away, but he couldn't keep up. The car disappeared down the winding mountain roads, and JC disappeared with it. Carl called 911 immediately. Within minutes, law enforcement descended on the quiet neighborhood. The FBI joined the investigation. Witnesses had seen the abduction. Carl had seen it with his own eyes. He could describe the vehicle, describe what had happened, but somehow, despite all of this, there were no reliable leads. No one could identify the kidnappers. No one knew where they had taken JC. The community rallied. Within weeks, tens of thousands of flyers and posters were mailed to businesses throughout the United States. The town of South Lake Tahoe was blanketed in pink ribbons. JC's stepfather founded a group called JC's Hope to coordinate volunteer and fundraising efforts. Cassette tapes of a song called JC Lee were sold, along with t-shirts and buttons, all to raise money for the search. On June 14, 1991, just 4 days after the kidnapping, JC's case was featured on the television show America's Most Wanted. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children became involved. A reward was offered, but as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks turned to months, and the months turned to years, hope began to fade. Where was JC? Was she still alive? The questions haunted her mother every single day. What Terry Probyn and the rest of JC's family didn't know was that their daughter was alive. She was living 170 miles away, hidden in plain sight in the small city of Antioch, California, in the backyard of a house on Walnut Avenue. To understand what happened to JC, we must understand the people who took her. Philip Craig Garrido was born on April 5, 1951 in Pittsburgh, California. He grew up in the nearby town of Brentwood and graduated from Liberty High School in 1969. His father would later say that Philip had been a good boy as a child, but something changed after a serious motorcycle accident as a teenager. The head injury from that accident seemed to mark a turning point. After high school, Philip became caught up in the counterculture of the 1960s San Francisco Bay Area. He grew his hair long, formed a band that played songs by Jefferson Airplane and Creedence Clearwater Revival, and painted his bedroom black, decorating it with psychedelic posters illuminated by black lights. But more troublingly, he began using drugs heavily: crystal methamphetamine, LSD, cocaine. His brother would later say that Philip became a fruitcake after getting hooked on hallucinogens and stimulants. In 1972, when Philip was 21 years old, he was arrested and charged with drugging and sexually assaulting a 14-year-old girl. But the charges were dropped when the victim refused to testify. 4 years later, in 1976, Philip committed a crime that should have kept him in prison for decades. On November 22nd of that year, he kidnapped a 25-year-old woman named Catherine Calloway from a supermarket parking lot in South Lake Tahoe, the same general area where he would later abduct JC. He took Catherine across state lines to Reno, Nevada, where he held her in a storage unit and repeatedly raped her for 5 hours. Catherine managed to escape when a police officer happened to stop by. Philip was arrested and convicted in both federal and state courts. He was sentenced to 50 years in federal prison for the kidnapping and another 5 years for the Nevada sexual assault. He should have been incarcerated until well into the 21st century, but he wasn't. While Philip was in prison at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, something unexpected happened. A woman named Nancy Bocanegra came to visit her uncle at the prison. Nancy was born in 1955 and worked as a nursing aide. During one of these visits, she met Philip. Despite knowing he was a convicted kidnapper and rapist, despite every warning sign, Nancy fell for him. In 1981, while Philip was still imprisoned, they married in a ceremony at Leavenworth Penitentiary. Then came the failure of the justice system that would seal JC's fate. In 1988, after serving just 11 years of his 50-year sentence, Philip Garrido was released on federal parole, 11 years for kidnapping and rape. The system that should have protected future victims instead released a predator back into society. Philip and Nancy moved to Antioch, California, to a house that belonged to Philip's mother. The property had something unusual, a large sprawling backyard that extended far beyond what was visible from the street. It was obscured by overgrown vegetation, trees, and a wooden fence. Behind that fence, hidden from view, Philip began constructing what would become a prison. For 3 years after his release, Philip was on parole, supposedly being monitored. Then, in 1991, the monitoring shifted from federal to state authorities, and on June 10th of that year, almost exactly 3 years after his release from prison, Philip and Nancy Garrido went hunting for a new victim. They found JC. When Philip and Nancy grabbed JC that June morning, they used a stun gun to incapacitate her. Nancy held the terrified child down in the back seat as they drove away. Later, JC would remember hearing Philip laughing in the front seat, saying, "I can't believe we got away with it." They drove her 170 miles to their home in Antioch. Hidden behind the fence in the backyard was a world completely separate from the normal suburban neighborhood on the other side. There were sheds no taller than 6 feet. There were tents. There was a primitive outhouse and a makeshift shower. One of the sheds had been soundproofed. This would be JC's world for the next 18 years. On that first day, Philip took JC into one of the sheds. He stripped off her clothes and burned her favorite pink outfit. He put handcuffs on her wrists. She was kept locked in that shed, unable to walk outside, unable to see the sun. 5 days later, Philip raped her for the first time. JC was 11 years old. Later she would describe it as her first taste of pure evil. The Garridos gave JC a new name. They told her she was now Alyssa. For the next 18 years she would not be allowed to write or speak her real name. In those early days and months of captivity, JC's only connection to the outside world was a small television set that Philip gave her. It was set to QVC, the home shopping channel. She would fall asleep to the sound of jewelry being sold, grateful just to hear human voices. She was completely alone, locked in a shed, with no one knowing where she was. Meanwhile, back in South Lake Tahoe, her family was desperately searching. They never gave up hope, even as the months stretched into years. Inside that hidden compound, JC tried to hold on to her identity. She kept a journal where she wrote about her family, wondering if they were looking for her. The Garridos had given her kittens at one point, perhaps to keep her compliant. But when they discovered she was signing her real name in a journal she kept about the kittens, they forced her to tear out the page. It would be the last time she was permitted to write her name for 18 years. The kittens mysteriously vanished after that. This was one of many psychological manipulations the Garridos used to control her. They alternated between seeming concerned about her and being cruel and cold. They lied to her constantly, telling her that her family had stopped looking for her, that no one cared anymore. They kept her in a constant state of fear and dependency. Almost 3 years into her captivity, when JC was about 14 years old, the Garridos began to allow her some freedom from the handcuffs, though they still kept her locked in the bolted shed. Eventually, Philip built an 8-foot-tall fence around the backyard and set up a tent for her. It was the first time since her kidnapping that she was allowed to walk outside. But then came something that would change everything. In 1994, when JC was just 13 years old, the Garridos told her she was pregnant. She had been putting on weight but didn't understand why. She knew nothing about sex before being kidnapped. She didn't even know she was in labor when the pain started. On August 18, 1994, 14-year-old JC gave birth to her first daughter in that backyard shed. There was no doctor, no hospital, no medical assistance of any kind, just Philip and Nancy delivering the baby in that hidden compound. 3 years later, in November of 1997, when JC was 17, she gave birth to her second daughter, again without any medical care. The little girls were taught to call Nancy Mom and Philip Dad. They were told that JC was their older sister. They grew up believing this lie. They never went to school. They never saw a doctor or a dentist. Their entire world was that backyard compound. One neighbor would later recall a strange conversation with one of the girls, not knowing she was actually JC's daughter. The child said they went to church in their basement. When asked how many people were in their church, she said 5. When asked who the pastor was, she said, "My dad." All of this was happening while Philip was supposed to be on parole, supposedly being supervised by authorities. Parole officers visited the house 60 times over the years. 60 times. They walked through the front yard. They spoke with Philip, but they never checked the backyard. They never discovered the hidden compound behind the fence. They never found JC. In 2006, 15 years into JC's captivity, a neighbor called 911. The caller reported that there were tents in the backyard with children living in them. They said Philip Garrido was psychotic with sexual addictions. A deputy sheriff came to the house and spoke with Garrido at the front door for about 30 minutes. He noted that there would be a code violation if people were living outside on the property. Then he left. He never searched the backyard. Philip was also wearing a GPS tracking device as part of his parole. The data from that device clearly showed him making numerous visits to the hidden backyard, spending long periods of time there. But no one was monitoring the device closely enough to notice or investigate. JC kept journals during her captivity. She wrote about being afraid, lonely, and depressed. She wrote about feeling unloved. Over time, her isolation became so complete that she began to crave any human interaction, even if it came from the people who had kidnapped her. In one journal entry, she wrote, "It feels like I'm sinking. I'm afraid I want control of my life. This is supposed to be my life to do with what I like. But once again he has taken it away. How many times is he allowed to take it away from me?" The years passed. 1992, 1995, 2000, 2005. JC had been taken as an 11-year-old child. Now she was a 28-year-old woman, mother to 2 daughters she'd given birth to in captivity. Her daughters were now 11 and 15 years old. They had never known freedom. They had never been to a real school. They had never been anywhere except that hidden backyard. But then in August of 2009, Philip Garrido made a decision that would finally bring JC's captivity to an end. By 2009, Philip Garrido had developed increasingly bizarre religious delusions. He believed he was a servant of God with special powers. He had written a rambling manifesto called Origin of Schizophrenia Revealed, in which he claimed he could control sounds with the human mind and prevent schizophrenics from turning violent. He had founded what he called a religious organization named God's Desire. In late August of 2009, Philip decided he wanted to distribute religious flyers on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. On August 24th, he went to the campus with JC's 2 daughters, now 15 and 11 years old, to inquire about getting a permit to hold a religious event. The university's special events manager, a woman named Lisa Campbell, spoke with him and told him to come back the next day. But something about the encounter troubled her. Something was off. She asked campus police officer Ale Jacobs to conduct a background check on Philip Garrido. When Officer Jacobs ran his name, she discovered that Philip was a registered sex offender on federal parole for kidnapping and rape. More concerning, his parole records indicated he had no children, yet he had shown up on campus with 2 young girls. Officer Jacobs contacted Philip's parole officer, Edward Santos Jr. Santos was shocked to hear that Garrido had been on campus with children. Throughout his supervision of Garrido, Philip had maintained he was childless. Santos ordered Philip to report to his parole office in Concord, California, for a meeting on August 26. When that day arrived, Philip showed up not just with the 2 girls, but also with Nancy and another woman, who identified herself as Alyssa. During the questioning, Alyssa told investigators that the 2 girls were her daughters. She said she knew that Philip was a convicted sex offender, but she insisted he was a changed man, a great person who was good with her kids. The 2 girls echoed these statements, defending the man they believed was their father. When investigators pressed Alyssa for details that would confirm her identity, she became extremely defensive and agitated. She demanded to know why she was being interrogated. She claimed she was a battered wife from Minnesota who was hiding from an abusive husband. The parole officer called the Concord police. When a police sergeant arrived and began asking questions, Philip finally broke. He nodded his head 3 times and said, "A long, long time ago, I kidnapped her and raped her when she was a child." Only after Philip's confession did the woman identify herself as JC Lee Dugard. Later, JC would explain why she had maintained the false identity for so long. She said she resisted revealing who she was out of fear that her children would be taken from her. She had lived with them for their entire lives. She had raised them in that backyard prison. They were all she had. The thought of losing them terrified her. But now, finally, after 18 years, the truth was out. On August 27, 2009, JC was reunited with her mother. The phone call between them was emotional beyond words. JC could barely speak through her tears. "Come quick," she managed to say. "Come quick." Her mother, Terry, who had never stopped believing her daughter might still be alive, who had kept her room ready for her return, who had replayed that last morning over and over in her mind, could finally tell her daughter, "I'm coming, baby, I'm coming." The story made headlines around the world. An 11-year-old girl who had been kidnapped in 1991 had been found alive in 2009. She was now 29 years old. She had 2 daughters. She had spent more time in captivity than she had spent in freedom. The El Dorado County Sheriff's Undersheriff, Fred Collar, described what investigators found at the Antioch property. There was a hidden backyard within a backyard, he said. It included several sheds, 2 tents, and several outbuildings where JC and the girls had spent most of their lives. One of the sheds was soundproof. The conditions were primitive, like camping. When asked about JC's condition, Collar said, "She is in good health, but living in a backyard for 18 years does take its toll." The legal proceedings moved relatively quickly once the truth was revealed. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested and charged with kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, lewd conduct with a minor, and other crimes. If convicted on all counts, they could face multiple life sentences. Initially, both defendants pleaded not guilty. But as the evidence mounted and the prospect of putting JC and her daughters through a trial became real, plea negotiations began. On April 28, 2011, nearly 2 years after JC's rescue, both Philip and Nancy Garrido entered guilty pleas. Philip pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 13 counts of sexual assault. Nancy pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping, 1 count of rape by force, and to California's one-strike rape law. On June 2, 2011, they were sentenced. Judge Douglas C. Phimister called Philip Garrido the poster child of a sexual predator. He sentenced him to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido received 36 years to life. Both waived their right to appeal. JC did not attend the sentencing hearing in person. Instead, she submitted a written statement that her mother read aloud in court. "I chose not to be here today because I refuse to waste another second of my life in your presence," JC wrote. "Philip Garrido, you are wrong. I could never say that to you before, but I have the freedom now, and I am saying you are a liar and all of your so-called theories are wrong. Everything you have ever done to me has been wrong, and someday I hope you can see that. What you and Nancy did was reprehensible. You always justified everything to suit yourself, but the reality is, and always has been, that to make someone else suffer for your inability to control yourself, and for you, Nancy, to facilitate his behavior and trick young girls for his pleasure, is evil. There is no God in the universe that would condone your actions." JC's mother also addressed the Garridos directly. "You are nothing other than selfish, self-serving, self-gratifying monsters," she said. She told them they would never see JC's daughters again. "Her daughters know what you did to their mother. They realize your backyard was a prison, and understand your filthy, despicable secret. They are aware that they have been deceived, and I am here to tell you that there is no love lost." JC's maternal aunt spoke about how the kidnapping had broken her own mother's heart. JC's grandmother, Anita, had died before seeing her granddaughter again. "JC was the center of my mom's world. as only a first grandchild can be, the aunt said. Facing life without her beloved JC was more than my mom could handle. I wish she had found the strength to live for me, for my brothers and sisters, and for her other grandchildren, but she couldn't. Losing JC was simply devastating, and she just couldn't recover. Beyond the criminal proceedings, there was another kind of justice to be sought. The failures of the parole system had been staggering. Officers had visited the Garrido property 60 times and never discovered JC. The GPS tracking device had shown Philip spending extensive time in the hidden backyard, but no one had properly monitored it. A neighbor had called to report children living in tents, and the responding officer had simply left without investigating. In 2010, the state of California awarded JC and her family $20 million in compensation for the failures of the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. A scathing investigation had concluded that the agency repeatedly failed to properly classify and supervise Philip Garrido. Philip is currently serving his sentence at Corcoran State Prison in California, in the Protective Housing Unit. He shares that unit with other notorious criminals including Charles Manson. Nancy is serving her sentence at the California Institution for Women in Chino. Both are eligible for parole in 2034, though given their sentences, release is virtually impossible. The story of what happened to JC in that backyard is horrifying, but equally important is the story of what happened after. How does someone heal from 18 years of captivity? How does someone who was kidnapped as an 11-year-old child and held until she was 29 years old, learn to live in freedom? JC has been remarkably open about her recovery process, in part because she wants to help other survivors of trauma. Immediately after her rescue, JC was reunited with her mother and sister. One of the first things she noticed was something she had written in a journal back in 2006. While still in captivity, she had made a list of dreams for the future, and at the top of that list was being reunited with her mother. Now that dream had come true, but reunion was only the beginning. JC and her daughters needed intensive therapy. They worked with Dr. Rebecca Bailey, a therapist who specializes in post-trauma family reunification. Bailey used horses as part of the therapy, allowing JC and her daughters to learn to ride and to build confidence through their interactions with the animals. One of the most important things of working with survivors of abduction is allowing them to have choices in every single thing they do, Dr. Bailey explained. Those things happen to her. They're not who she is. Slowly, very slowly, JC began to reclaim her life. She learned to drive. She enrolled her daughters in school, giving them the education they had never received. She adopted pets that couldn't be taken away from her. Unlike the kittens Philip had used to manipulate her, she moved into a house with her daughters, creating a real home for the first time. She also started checking off items from a bucket list she had made while in captivity. She went swimming with dolphins. She rode in a hot air balloon. She traveled to Belize to see the pyramids. These were all things she had dreamed about during those years in the backyard. In 2011, JC published her first book, A Stolen Life, a memoir. She wrote it as part of her therapy working with Dr. Bailey. The book became a bestseller and gave JC a platform to share her story in her own words. A few days before the book was released, she gave her first major interview to Diane Sawyer on ABC's. In that interview, JC spoke about her first memory of freedom. She described calling her mother and barely being able to speak through the tears. She talked about her connection to her mother and how they had both been replaying the same moment for 18 years. That last morning when Terry had chosen not to go into JC's room to say goodbye because she wanted to get to work on time. "You remember it too?" JC asked her mother during the interview.
"Oh God."
The two women held hands, their bodies turned toward each other, sharing a bond forged through unimaginable loss and miraculous reunion. JC also addressed the speculation that she had suffered from Stockholm Syndrome, the psychological phenomenon where captives develop positive feelings toward their captors. She pushed back strongly against this characterization. "It's degrading having my family believe that I was in love with this captor and wanted to stay with him," she told Diane Sawyer. "I mean, that is so far from the truth that it makes me want to throw up. It's disgusting. I adapted to survive my circumstances. There's just no other way to put it. He was always my captor." She explained that her initial reluctance to identify herself wasn't about loyalty to Philip, it was about protecting her daughters. "I couldn't leave. I had the girls," she said. She was terrified they would be taken from her. In 2016, JC released her second book, Freedom, My Book of Firsts. This book focused on her life after rescue, on the process of reintegration into the world. She gave another interview to Diane Sawyer, her third, discussing how far she had come and the challenges that remained. "I feel like I have lived a lot of lifetimes," JC said. She talked about how she was living her awkward teenage years as a woman approaching 40, still figuring out who she was, still learning things most people learned decades earlier. She described everyday experiences that others take for granted. Even after 7 years of freedom, she still had to adjust to normal life. Her eyes remained sensitive to sunlight after so many years of being kept mostly indoors. She was learning to navigate social situations, to understand social cues, to function in a world that had changed dramatically during her captivity. She had been taken before the internet became ubiquitous, before cell phones were common, before social media existed. When asked about relationships and dating, JC admitted it was something she thought about. The only time she had ever been asked on a date was when she was 8 years old, and she had been too shy to even look at the boy. Her daughters, she said with a laugh, wanted her to find someone, but for now there were no men in her life in that way. One of the most difficult aspects of her recovery has been dealing with regret. JC says she has to consciously choose every single day not to give in to it. She knows she lost 18 years of her life, years she can never get back. But she also knows that dwelling on that loss would mean giving Philip and Nancy even more of her time. "I didn't want to give one more minute to Philip and Nancy," she said. "They took 18 years of my life. I would like to see them in jail for the rest of their lives." In addition to writing and doing occasional interviews, JC founded the JC Foundation, a non-profit organization that provides support to families dealing with abduction and other traumatic losses. The foundation is her way of turning her experience into something that can help others. As for her daughters, JC has been fiercely protective of their privacy. Their names have never been publicly released. In 2016, JC revealed that both daughters were attending college. She has spoken about how proud she is of them, how they have overcome tremendous challenges, how resilient they have proven to be. The question of whether her daughters might want to see Philip Garrido someday is one JC has had to contemplate. When asked about it, she said, "I wouldn't be okay with it, but I wouldn't stop them." It's a testament to her commitment to giving her daughters the choices she never had. JC and her daughters now live somewhere in California, in an undisclosed location, away from public attention. They have built a life together, a real life, with school and friends and pets and all the normal things that were denied to them for so long. When JC's mother, Terry, was interviewed years after the rescue, she admitted that even after all that time, she still experienced moments of terror when JC was out of her sight. The thoughts flood. Is she going to come back? Am I ever going to see her again? Terry said. And then I'll hear her skulking around the kitchen and I'll think, oh, it's okay. She is here, she is home. The case of JC Dugard is one that challenges our understanding of human endurance and the capacity for recovery. It's a story that asks difficult questions about our justice system, about how a convicted kidnapper and rapist could be released after serving just 11 years of a 50-year sentence, about how parole supervision could fail so completely that 60 visits to a parolee's home over 18 years never uncovered the victim living in his backyard, about how a neighbor's call reporting children in tents could be dismissed after a 30-minute conversation at the front door. But it's also a story about the unbreakable bond between a mother and daughter, about a woman who never gave up hope, who kept her daughter's room ready for 18 years, believing against all odds that JC would come home, about a little girl who held on to her identity even when she wasn't allowed to speak her own name, who survived by thinking about her family, who endured the unendurable and somehow found her way back. It's a story about two alert campus police officers who trusted their instincts when something seemed off, who did a background check and made a phone call that would end an 18-year nightmare. Lisa Campbell and Allie Jacobs' decision to investigate changed 3 lives forever. And perhaps most remarkably, it's a story about healing, about a woman who was taken at 11 and found at 29, who has spent the years since learning to drive, going back to school, swimming with dolphins, writing books, founding a non-profit, raising her daughters, and slowly, carefully, beautifully, reclaiming the life that was stolen from her. J.C. Dugard once said she feels like she has lived many lifetimes. In a way she has. There was the life before her kidnapping, those first 11 years of childhood in a loving home. There was the life in captivity, 18 years that tested the limits of human resilience, and now there is this life, this hard-won freedom, this daily choice to move forward rather than dwell on what was lost. When asked what message she would give to other survivors of trauma, JC has emphasized the importance of therapy, the value of staying out of the public eye during recovery, and the need to give oneself time. It's taken a lot of time, she said. It hasn't happened overnight. Her story reminds us that survival is possible, even in the darkest circumstances, that healing is possible, even from the most profound trauma, that hope, sometimes, against all logic and reason, can prove to be justified. Today, J.C. Dugard is in her mid-40s, her daughters are in their 20s. They have built a life together, away from the cameras and the headlines, in some quiet place where they can simply be a family. The backyard compound where they were held is long gone, torn down and erased. Philip Garrido will spend the rest of his life in prison. Nancy Garrido will likely do the same. The house on Walnut Avenue has new owners who have no connection to the terrible things that happened there. But the story endures. It endures as a warning about the failures of our systems. It endures as inspiration for other survivors. And it endures as a testament to the strength of the human spirit, to the power of a mother's love, and to the possibility of finding light even after 18 years of darkness. J.C. Lee Dugard walked up a hill to a school bus stop on a June morning in 1991. She didn't know that morning that her life was about to change in the most horrible way imaginable, but she also couldn't have known that she would survive, that she would be found, that she would be reunited with her family, that she would write books and help others and raise her daughters and live to see them grow into strong, resilient young women. Sometimes the darkest stories have endings we could never have imagined. Sometimes people endure what seems unendurable. Sometimes, even after 18 years, there is still hope for a morning when the phone rings and a voice on the other end says, "We found her." And sometimes, just sometimes, that's enough. If you're still awake and listening, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. Tonight we're going to explore a story together, one that begins in the vast, quiet landscape of South Africa's northern Cape. This is a tale of family, secrets, and the slow unraveling of truth in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's name. Griekwestad. The name itself feels like wind across the veld. It's a small farming community in the northern Cape province of South Africa, about 168 kilometers west of the city of Kimberley. The land here is dry, often unforgiving, with scrubby bushes dotting red earth that seems to stretch forever under an immense blue sky. It's the kind of place where farming families have worked the land for generations, where neighbors know each other's struggles and triumphs, where the rhythm of life follows the seasons and the needs of livestock. In Griekwestad, time moves differently, slower, quieter. The town was once called Griquatown, established in the early 1800s as the first settlement north of the Orange River. It has a history woven through missionary work, colonial disputes, and the blending of cultures in the harsh beauty of the South African interior. But by 2012, it was simply a tight-knit farming community, where families gathered at church on Sundays and children played in the dust while their parents talked about rainfall and market prices. One of these families was the Steenkamps. They lived on a farm called Naiwuk, just outside town. The farm sat in that characteristic northern Cape landscape, isolated but not lonely, connected to Griekwestad by a 10-kilometer stretch of dirt road that turned to dust in dry season and mud when the rains finally came. Dion Steenkamp was 44 years old in the spring of 2012. He was known around town as a hard-working farmer, a man who understood sheep and land, and the delicate balance required to make a living in such an arid place. Those who knew him well described him as skilled with his hands, practical, someone who could fix almost anything that broke on the farm. His wife, Crystal, was 43. Together they had built a life at Naiwuk, raising their 2 children in the wide open spaces, teaching them the value of hard work and faith. They were a church-going family, regular attendees at the local congregation, part of the fabric of the community. Their daughter, Marthella, was 14 years old. She was at that tender age between childhood and young adulthood, still finding her way in the world. Like her brother, she enjoyed tent pegging, a traditional equestrian sport popular in rural South Africa, where riders use lances or swords to pick up ground targets while galloping on horseback. It requires precision, courage, and a deep bond with your horse. To the outside world, the Steenkamps appeared to be what one neighbor called a model family, close, loving, the kind of family you'd expect to see at community gatherings, helping neighbors, living the life that rural South Africa had offered for generations. But as we know in these stories, appearances can be deceiving, and sometimes, the darkness that lives within a family is the kind that no outsider could ever see. It was April 6, 2012, Good Friday, the day of quiet observance in Christian communities around the world, a day when many South African families gather for church services and meals together. The autumn air in the northern Cape would have been cooling after the heat of summer, the sun setting earlier, painting the veld in shades of gold and amber. On the Steenkamp farm, the day unfolded as many others had. There were chores to complete, animals to tend, the familiar rhythms of farm life. Don was home from boarding school for the Easter holiday. The family went about their routines on this quiet Friday. But as dusk approached, something happened at Naiwuk farm, something that would shatter the peace of Griekwestad and send shockwaves through all of South Africa. Shortly before 7 o'clock in the evening, as the last light was fading from the sky, an Isuzu bakkie came roaring into Griekwestad, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake. The vehicle didn't slow as it approached the town center. Instead, it accelerated, finally screeching to a halt directly in front of the nearly deserted police station. The driver's door flew open, and a teenage boy burst out. He was dressed only in black rugby shorts. His brown hair was tousled, disheveled. His face, his hands, his bare chest were covered in blood. As officers inside the station looked up in alarm, the boy ran through the door and collapsed to his knees on the floor of the charge office. "You must come," he cried out, his voice breaking. "They've been shot. They're all dead." The boy was 15-year-old Don Steenkamp, and he was referring to his mother, his father, and his sister. The police officers who responded that evening drove through the gathering darkness to Nauruk Farm, following Don back along that 10-kilometer stretch of road. What they found there would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Inside the farmhouse, in the living room where the family would have gathered on countless ordinary evenings, lay the bodies of Dion and Crystal Steenkamp. Both had been shot multiple times. The violence was extreme, methodical. They had been killed with 2 different firearms, a .357 revolver and a .22 caliber weapon. Both guns belonged to the family. The parents had been shot in execution style. First wounded, then, as investigators would later determine, struck in the back of the head with a blunt object before being shot again to ensure they were dead. The scene was one of deliberate, calculated murder. And then there was Marthella. The 14-year-old girl had also been shot multiple times. But the evidence at the scene suggested something even more disturbing. There were signs of a struggle. Blood splatter patterns outside the house in front of the barn told a story of violence that had begun before anyone entered the farmhouse. Marthella's death had not been quick or merciful. The amount of blood was overwhelming. It covered walls, floors, pooled in the rooms where the family had died. For the officers who first arrived, it seemed clear that this was a farm attack, one of the violent crimes that had plagued rural South Africa for years, where intruders would assault isolated farming families in brutal home invasions. Don told the police his version of events. He said he had been in the barn, about 50 meters from the house, doing chores when he heard gunshots. Terrified, he had hidden there until the shooting stopped. When silence finally fell, he had cautiously made his way to the house. Inside, he found his parents dead. He found Marthella still alive, but barely. He tried to pick her up, to help her, but she died in his arms. As she died, he said, she had grabbed at his shirt, tearing it, leaving blood on the fabric and on him. Panicked, grief-stricken, covered in his sister's blood, Don had fled. He jumped into his father's bakkie and raced toward town to get help. On his way, he claimed, he found the 2 murder weapons discarded at the farm gate. He picked them up and brought them with him to the police station, handing them over when he arrived. But as the officers examined the scene more carefully, questions began to emerge. Small things at first, inconsistencies, details that didn't quite align with Don's account of what had happened. And slowly, inexorably, those questions would grow. The investigation fell to Colonel Dick DeWaal of the Hawks, South Africa's elite detective unit. DeWaal was an experienced investigator, someone who had seen countless crime scenes, who understood that the truth often hides in the smallest details. As he examined Nauruk Farm in the days following the murders, certain things troubled him. The crime scene was remarkably contained. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to have been stolen from the house. For a supposed farm attack, where the motive is typically robbery, the scene was unusual. Farm attacks in South Africa often involved signs of ransacking, missing valuables, evidence that intruders had searched the property for money or goods to steal. Then there was the forensic evidence. A team of experts processed every inch of the crime scene, collecting 72 separate DNA and fingerprint samples. They analyzed blood spatter patterns, tested for gunshot residue, examined the weapons, reconstructed the sequence of events based on the physical evidence, and what they found was troubling. No forensic evidence indicated the presence of anyone else at the crime scene, except for the 4 members of the Steenkamp family. No unknown fingerprints, no DNA from an intruder, nothing to suggest that strangers had come to Nauyuik Farm that night. The blood spatter analysis was particularly revealing. Experts could tell from the patterns where each person had been when they were shot, the angles of the wounds, the sequence of events, and what they found contradicted Don's version of what had happened. Don had said that Marthella died in his arms, inside the house, after the shooting had stopped, but the blood evidence told a different story. Blood splatter and bloody footprints found outside the house, in front of the barn, suggested that Marthella had received her fatal wounds before she ever entered the house. If that was true, it would have been impossible for Don not to have heard her being attacked from where he claimed to be hiding in the barn, just 50 meters away. The barn was close enough that screams would have been clearly audible, and according to medical evidence, Marthella had been violently attacked before being shot. She would have screamed. Investigators photographed Don on the night of the murders. In those photographs, visible on his neck, were scratch marks, deep scratches, the kind made by fingernails during a struggle. When asked about them, Don initially said he couldn't remember how he got them. Later he admitted that he and Marthella had fought that afternoon, but he claimed he couldn't remember what the fight was about. This troubled Dewal deeply. If you had fought with your sister just hours before your entire family was murdered, wouldn't that memory be crystal clear? Wouldn't every detail of that day be seared into your mind? Then there was Don's clothing. The torn shirt he wore when he arrived at the police station was tested extensively. Yes, there was Marthella's blood on it, consistent with his story that he had held her. But the blood splatter patterns didn't match his description of events. Forensic experts testified that based on where the blood was and how it had gotten there, Marthella would have been too weak, too close to death, to have the strength to grab his shirt hard enough to tear it. The ballistics evidence was perhaps most damning. Both weapons Don had turned in to police, the .357 revolver and the .22 caliber firearm, had been used in the murders. The timing of events that Don described simply didn't work. He claimed he had hidden in the barn, heard shots, waited, gone into the house, found his sister alive, watched her die, then fled in the backy. On his way out, he said, he found the guns discarded at the farm gate and picked them up. But the ballistics experts calculated the timing. The sequence Don described would have taken longer than was physically possible. Moreover, he claimed to have heard additional shots after he drove away, before finding the guns. But if both murder weapons were at the gate when he left, who could have fired those additional shots? The timeline didn't make sense. And there was another piece of evidence, one that investigators kept confidential during the early stages of the investigation. Medical examination revealed that Marthella had been sexually assaulted in the 24 hours before her death. She had suffered genital injuries consistent with rape. This changed everything. Because if Marthella had been raped, if she had been violated by someone in the hours before the murders, then suddenly there was a motive, a terrible dark motive that explained why an entire family might be killed. Someone had wanted to silence Marthella, and perhaps to silence anyone she might have told. As word of the murders spread through Griquastad, the community was devastated. The Steenkamps had been well known, well liked. They were regular churchgoers, active in community life. Dion had been a member of the local agricultural union. The children were involved in tent-pegging competitions. This wasn't a family that lived on the margins. They were woven into the fabric of the town. A memorial service was held. Don sat between his 2 grandmothers, Betty Steenkamp and Marty Masson, visibly emotional and distraught. The family had shielded him from the media, protecting this traumatized boy who had, they believed, survived a horrific attack that had claimed his parents and sister. But other voices told different stories. Some of the farm workers who had known the family spoke more cautiously. They described Dion as hot-tempered, someone who would shout at his wife, his children, his workers, though they also said he was a fair employer who paid them well and on time. The picture that emerged was more complex, more human. A family that, like many families, had their tensions and their struggles hidden behind closed doors. As the days passed and the investigation continued, rumors began to circulate. Small-town dynamics meant that everyone had an opinion, everyone had heard something. Some people defended Don fiercely, unable to believe that a 15-year-old boy, a church-going student, a national champion in his sport, could have done something so unthinkable. Others began to wonder, to question, to look at the facts, and feel a growing unease. 4 months after that terrible Good Friday, on August 21st, 2012, Don Steenkamp was arrested and charged with the murders of his parents and sister, with the rape of Marthella, and with defeating the ends of justice by lying to police. The news shocked South Africa. This wasn't just another farm attack. This was something far more sinister, far more disturbing. A teenage boy accused of murdering his entire family. The case gripped the nation, dividing public opinion. Could it be true? Could a child really do something so horrific? Don was held in the Youth Corrections Center in Kimberley while awaiting trial. His bail hearing revealed more details of the case against him. Colonel DeWaal testified about the forensic evidence, the inconsistencies in Don's story, the physical evidence that contradicted his version of events. The prosecutor argued that Don should be denied bail. They presented evidence of his access to weapons, noting that even while under suspicion, he had gone hunting and shot a kudu. DeWaal spoke plainly about his concerns. Who will be safe near him? The murder trial finally began at the end of 2013, nearly 2 years after the murders. It was held in the Northern Cape High Court in Kimberley, with Judge President Frans Kagomo presiding. The case drew intense media attention. Journalists from across South Africa covering every development, every piece of testimony. Throughout the trial, Prosecutor Hannes Clodem methodically presented the state's case. Forensic experts testified about the blood evidence. Ballistic specialists explained why Don's timeline was impossible. Medical examiners detailed the injuries to all 3 victims, the execution-style nature of the murders, the evidence of sexual assault. DeWaal testified about the investigation, about the 72 DNA and fingerprint tests that found no evidence of anyone else at the crime scene. He described how Don's story had changed multiple times, as new evidence came to light, how the young man had offered different explanations for the blood on his clothes, the scratches on his neck, his whereabouts during the crucial minutes when his family was killed. His defense team suggested alternative theories. They proposed that perhaps Dion, the father, had been responsible for Marthella's sexual assault. They argued that the forensic evidence, while compelling, was open to interpretation. They portrayed Don as a victim, a traumatized child who had survived something unspeakable and was now being persecuted for it. But Judge Kagomo was not convinced. On March 27, 2014, Judge Frans Kagomo delivered his verdict. After reviewing all the evidence, all the testimony, all the forensic reports, he found Don Steenkamp guilty on all charges, guilty of 3 counts of premeditated murder, guilty of rape, guilty of defeating the ends of justice. In his judgment, Judge Kagomo laid out the reasoning that had led him to this conclusion. He addressed the forensic evidence, the ballistics, the blood spatter analysis, the impossibility of Don's version of events. He spoke about the scratch marks on Don's neck, the fight with Marthella that Don couldn't explain, the blood evidence that told a story of violence and struggle. Most significantly, Kaigomo addressed the motive. He stated his belief that Dawn had sexually assaulted Marthella, that she had either threatened to tell their parents or had already told them, and that Dawn had murdered all three family members to prevent the truth from coming out. The judge noted that he believed this was not the first time Marthella had been victimized, that there was evidence of ongoing abuse. The need to silence Marthella, to eliminate the witnesses to his crime, was, in the judge's view, the only logical explanation for why a 15-year-old boy would commit such brutal, methodical murders. Gomo spoke directly to Dawn during the verdict. He dismissed the defense's suggestions about the father being responsible for Marthella's injuries, calling it an attempt to counter the state's argument. He questioned how Marthella could have died lovingly in Dawn's arms, as he claimed, given the violent nature of her death. He pointed out that Dawn would have been too nauseated by blood to comfort his dying sister if his version was true, yet he had pushed her away violently while she reached out to him. The evidence, the judge concluded, was overwhelming. Dawn Steenkamp had killed his family. The community of Greek-Wastad was divided. Some accepted the verdict, believing that justice had been served. Others continued to believe in Dawn's innocence, unable to reconcile the smiling teenager they knew with the cold-blooded killer described in court. On August 13, 2014, just 2 days before his 18th birthday, Dawn Steenkamp was sentenced. Judge Kaigomo sentenced him to 20 years imprisonment for each murder conviction, 12 years for the rape of Marthella, and 4 years for defeating the ends of justice. In total, it amounted to 76 years. But under South African law at that time, a minor younger than 16 could not be sentenced to more than 20 years in prison regardless of the severity of the crimes. Since Dawn had been 15 years and 8 months old when he committed the murders, the sentences would run concurrently. Effectively, he would serve 20 years. In the courtroom, Judge Kaigomo spoke final words to the teenager before him. "In 2 days you are a man," he said. "Now be a man." Dawn's grandmother, 88-year-old Betty Steenkamp, issued a statement saying she had chosen to forgive her grandson. She said she would always love him, but pleaded that he receive necessary psychiatric and psychological help so that one day he might make a positive contribution to society. The case raised difficult questions about family dynamics, about the secrets that can exist behind closed doors, about warning signs that might have been missed. How does a 15-year-old boy, by all outward appearances a normal teenager, become capable of such violence? What had happened in that family that led to this terrible night? There were no simple answers. Some pointed to possible psychological issues, wondering if Dawn had shown signs of disturbance that had been overlooked or misunderstood. Others questioned the family dynamics, the relationships between parents and children, whether there had been tensions or conflicts that no outsider could see. The case also sparked broader conversations in South Africa about farm attacks, about violence in rural communities, about the justice system's treatment of juvenile offenders. The fact that Dawn could only receive a maximum of 20 years due to his age at the time of the murders troubled many who felt the sentence was too lenient for such heinous crimes. Years later, when Dawn became eligible to apply for parole, the family issued statements expressing their concerns. They wanted strict conditions, thorough psychiatric evaluations, assurance that he would pose no risk to society. In 2024, when Dawn applied for parole after serving 10 years of his sentence, he was denied. The parole board determined he should remain in prison. He is now 28 years old, still serving his sentence. The murders were chronicled in a book by journalist Jacques Steenkamp, who had covered the case from the beginning, and later adapted into a film. But for those who lived through it, who knew the family, who had to reconcile the image of a quiet farm boy with the reality of what he had done, the scars remain. The Greek Wasted murders remind us that human nature contains depths of darkness we often prefer not to acknowledge. In trying to understand how a teenage boy could kill his parents and sister, we're confronted with uncomfortable truths about family, about secrets, about the masks people wear even with those closest to them. Judge K. Gomo believed that Don killed to cover up his sexual assault of his sister, to prevent the truth from coming out, to eliminate the witnesses who could destroy his life. If this is accurate, then the murders were the ultimate act of self-preservation by someone willing to sacrifice everything and everyone to protect himself. But even knowing the facts of the case, even understanding the evidence that led to Don's conviction, something about the Greek Westad murders resists easy comprehension. How does a child become this? What combination of nature and nurture, of psychology and circumstance, creates someone capable of such calculated violence against their own family? We may never fully understand, and perhaps that's what makes cases like this so haunting. They remind us that sometimes, the people we think we know, the families that seem normal from the outside, can hide terrors that no one suspects until it's too late. And so we come to the end of this story. A terrible story, a sad story, but one that happened in the real world to real people in a small town in South Africa. The farmhouse at Nahuk still stands, though it carries the weight of what happened there. The people of Greek Westad still remember that Good Friday in 2012, when everything changed. Take a deep breath now. Let this story settle. Let the tension release from your shoulders, your jaw, your hands. These events happened far away, in another time. You are here now, safe and warm. As you drift towards sleep, let go of the darkness in this tale. Remember instead the resilience of the human spirit, the family members who found the strength to forgive, the investigators who pursued justice with dedication and care. Even in the darkest stories, there are people who do the right thing, who seek truth, who try to heal. Thank you so much for spending your night with Midnight Crime Stories. I hope the stories kept you company and helped you drift a little closer to sleep. If you're still awake, leave a final comment. Tell me which story stood out to you the most tonight. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more calm, late-night true crime. Sleep well, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.